Chapter 1. The shears snapped with a metal-sharp finality, severing a cluster of overripe mint stalks. Saffron Thorne did not look up from the dirt. She focused instead on the pungent, sharp scent that rose from the bruised leaves, a fragrance so aggressive it seemed to scrub the very air. She worked with a frantic precision, deadheading the mint not to encourage new growth, but to maintain a perimeter of scent so oppressive it functioned as a wall. In the damp soil of the library garden, the mint was a green tide, surging against the curated borders of the village's prestige. Saffron knelt in the loam, her skirts already stained a deep, earthy ochre, her fingers blackened at the tips. This was her fortress, a sanctuary where the only expectations were the seasonal rhythms of the soil and the silent demands of the perennials. From the periphery of her vision, the village elite drifted past the iron gates like pale ghosts. She watched them, the daughters of merchants in their stiff muslin, the matrons with their powdered faces, and noted the way they instinctively veered away from the widow's patch. They treated the garden as a site of contagion, as if her mourning were a blight that could leap from the mint to their silk hems. Saffron welcomed the distance. Invisibility was a luxury she had cultivated as carefully as her rare orchids. To be forgotten by the ton was to be free from the performative grief they expected of a widow, the curated size and the precise duration of black crepe. Here, amidst the damp earth and the smell of crushed herbs, she did not have to be a cautionary tale of loss. She was simply a part of the undergrowth. The rhythmic snap of her shears was suddenly severed by a different sound, the sharp, metronomic tapping of a fan against a palm. Saffron froze. The sound was a percussion of power, a signal of arrival that required no announcement. She did not need to lift her gaze to know that the silence of her sanctuary had been breached. The air shifted, the scent of damp earth suddenly warring with a cloying, artificial cloud of night-bloom scent and expensive powder. Beatrix Sterling stepped into the garden, her skirts trailing over the damp earth with a deliberate lack of caution. Each step was a calculated intrusion, the heavy silk of her gown brushing against the mint, flattening the very stems Saffron had spent the morning tending. Beatrix did not look at the plants. She studied Saffron as one might look at a smudge on a piece of fine porcelain. She stopped a mere foot from Saffron's kneeling form, the tip of her fan poised like a weapon. The rhythmic tapping ceased, replaced by a stillness that felt like a held breath before a blow. "The state of these grounds is quite extraordinary, is it not?" Beatrix began, her voice a polished blade of forced kindness. "One almost forgets that a library is intended to be a beacon of civilization, rather than a wilderness of aromatic weeds. It is a curious choice, Saffron, to cultivate a garden that smells so pointedly of a kitchen pantry." Saffron felt the familiar constriction in her throat, a physical tightening that turned her words into stones. She gripped the shears tightly, her knuckles white against the rusted metal. She wanted to explain that the mint was a shield, that the sharpness of the scent drowned out the hollow silence of her own house, but the words remained locked behind a wall of social terror. Instead, she tugged at her apron strings, her eyes fixed on the dirt. The soil requires a balance," Saffron managed, her voice thin and wavering. "The mint, it anchors the perimeter. If one disturbs the root systems too abruptly, the entire structure of the bed collapses. The perennials depend on the stability of the undergrowth." Beatrix tilted her head, a slight, judgmental movement that suggested she found the botanical explanation quaintly irrelevant. Stability is a virtue, certainly, but it must not be confused with stagnation. The library has long been a neglected relic, a crumbling testament to a past that no longer serves our current standing. As the primary patron, I have decided that a modern restoration is imperative. We shall replace these haphazard patches with a formal French parterre, symmetrical, disciplined, and reflective of the prestige this village deserves. Saffron's heart gave a sharp, irregular thud. A French parterre meant the erasure of everything she had built. It meant the removal of the wild corners where the Grease shadows lived, the replacement of her intuitive sanctuary with a curated exhibition of wealth. The autonomy she had clawed back from the ruins of her marriage was being stripped away in a single, clipped sentence. She looked up then, her eyes meeting Beatrix's cold, calculating gaze. She tried to find a word, a plea, a protest, a demand, but the social hierarchy of the village acted as a muzzle. She was a widow of modest means. Beatrix was the architect of the village's social order. She is erasing me, Saffron thought, the realization spiking through her like a needle. She isn't just pruning the garden, she is pruning my existence from the map of this town. To her, I am a weed in a formal garden, a remnant of a tragedy that disrupts the symmetry of her curated world. If the garden goes, where do I go? I have spent 3 years building a wall of green, and she has walked through it as if it were smoke. Beatrix smiled, though the expression that stayed cold. I trust you understand the necessity of this transition. A woman of your precarious standing should be grateful for the patronage that keeps these halls open. It would be a pity if the library were to close entirely due to a lack of aesthetic appeal. You may continue to assist with the transition, provided you can follow a proper blueprint. Without waiting for a response, Beatrix turned on her heel. As she pivoted, her heavy leather shoe landed squarely on a fresh sprig of mint. Saffron watched in slow motion as the stem snapped and the leaves were ground into the mud, the vibrant green crushed into a dull, bruised gray. The sensory shock of it, the smell of the broken plant rising in a sudden, violent burst, felt like a physical blow to Saffron's chest. Beatrix drifted away, her skirt sweeping the earth, leaving behind a trail of flattened herbs and a vacuum of silence. Saffron remained on her knees for a long time, staring at the crushed sprig. The fortress had been breached. The invisibility she had relied upon was no longer a shield, but a vulnerability. She felt a sudden, desperate need to be inside, away from the open air and the judgment of the sky. She stood slowly, her muscles stiff, and wiped her blackened hands on her apron, though the soil only smeared further into the fabric. She retreated toward the heavy oak doors of the library, the sanctuary of the archives. She expected the doors to be locked, as they usually were, during the midday lull, providing her with a private space to breathe among the scent of old vellum and dust. But as she reached for the iron handle, the door yielded with a heavy, echoing creak. It was already unlocked. Saffron stepped into the dim, cool air of the main hall, the silence of the interior pressing against her ears. She moved toward the central reading table, the heart of the archive, but stopped short. Resting on the scarred mahogany surface was an object that did not belong, a large, weathered leather satchel, its straps worn to a pale tan, smelling of old ink and distant travel. Beside it lay a pair of glasses, and a stack of handwritten notes in a script she didn't recognize, but which looked meticulously, obsessively organized. The library was no longer her private ruin. Someone had already moved in. Chapter 2. The ledger was a liar, and Hassan al-Rashid was not a man who tolerated inaccuracies. He stood in the center of the library's main hall, the air thick with the smell of damp limestone and the slow, acidic rot of neglected vellum. He held the volume open with 2 fingers, as if it were a contaminated specimen, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. "Preposterous," he said, his voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceiling. To list the acquisitions of 1812 as miscellaneous is not merely an oversight, it is a scholarly crime. One does not simply categorize a first-edition translation of Al-Farabi as miscellaneous. He looked around the room. The archives were in a state of elegant collapse. Shelves leaned at precarious angles, and a single shaft of sunlight illuminated a million dancing motes of dust that seemed to mock his desire for order. He had spent a decade in the great libraries of Europe and the East, mastering the art of paleography and the patience of the scribe, only to return to his childhood home and find the record of its intellect reduced to a series of smudge marks and vague summaries. He felt a surge of academic indignation that vibrated in his chest. He wanted to scrub the walls, to reindex every scroll, to breathe life back into the silent, decaying ghosts of the stacks. But the chaos was suffocating. He needed air, and he needed it before he succumbed to the urge to scream at a book. He pushed through the heavy oak doors, the iron hinges groaning in protest, and stepped out into the garden. The transition was violent. He moved from the monochrome gloom of the archives into a riot of green and gold that felt almost intrusive in its vibrancy. He stopped mid-stride. 10 paces away, a woman stood among the borders. She was dressed in a faded gown of muted gray, her apron stained with the honest dark loam of the earth. She was bent over a patch of soil, her movements slow and rhythmic, almost liturgical. Hassan froze. The academic detachment he had cultivated like a shield, the formal distance of the scholar shattered. The woman turned slightly, and the light caught the profile of a face he had spent years trying to reconstruct from memory. "Saffron?" he whispered. The name felt strange in his throat, a word from a forgotten language. Saffron did not jump, she merely stilled. She did not look up immediately, her gaze remaining fixed on the soil. She tugged at the string of her apron, a small, nervous gesture that Hassan recognized with a jolt of electricity. It was the same habit she had possessed at 12, when they had hidden in the hollow of an old oak to read forbidden poetry. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon the polished cadence of a gentleman, but his voice wavered. Saffron Thorne, I had heard you remained here, but the reports were vague. It has been a very long time. Saffron finally looked at him, though her eyes did not quite meet his. She focused instead on the bridge of his nose, or perhaps his glasses. She said nothing. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the ghosts of childhood promises and the vast, yawning gap of a decade's absence. She shifted her weight, her fingers curling around a dried, brown seed pod she had been inspecting. She held it like a talisman, a wall of organic matter between her and the man who had returned from the world. Hassan felt a sudden, desperate need to bridge the distance, yet he found himself paralyzed by the propriety of the moment. He was a man of letters, yet he found himself without a single sentence that did not feel clumsy. He looked away, his gaze wandering to the corner of the garden, where a small, sheltered alcove of stone protected a single, stubborn bloom. It was a pale, iridescent blue, its petals curling inward like a secret. He stopped breathing. He moved closer, his voice softening, losing its formal edge. "The gentianus," he murmured. "The spring gentian. I remember the day we planted the seeds. You told me that if we whispered to them, they would grow faster because they liked the sound of secrets." Saffron's shoulders dropped an inch. She studied the flower, and for a fleeting second a ghost of a smile touched her lips. Not a smile of joy, but of shared recognition. The blue of the flower was an exact match for the ink they had used to map out their imaginary kingdom as children. For a moment, the years collapsed. They were no longer a grieving widow and a foreign scholar. They were two children in a world that had not yet told them how to be lonely. "They do not like secrets," Saffron said, her voice soft and rhythmic, like the rustle of wind through dry corn. "They like the shade and the silence." "A preference I can appreciate," Hassan replied, his voice barely audible. Mr. San replied, "Al-Rashid." The voice sliced through the intimacy like a blade. They both turned to see Beatrix Sterling gliding toward them, her silk skirt sweeping the gravel with a rhythmic, predatory hiss. She held a folding fan closed in her hand, tapping it against her palm in a steady, hypnotic beat. She did not look at Saffron, she looked through her, as if the woman were merely a particularly dull piece of shrubbery. "I trust you have found the archives to your liking, Hassan," Beatrix said, her voice a steady and forced kindness. She stopped beside him, the scent of heavy, cloying lily-of-the-valley trailing after her. "Though I suspect you find the current state of the ledgers challenging. It is a pity that the previous administration was so lax with the accounts." Hassan straightened, his academic posture returning. "Indeed, Mrs. Sterling, the lack of organization is systemic. I believe a complete audit and a revised budget for preservation materials are necessary if we are to save the collection." Beatrix's fan stopped tapping. She tilted her head, a small, judgmental movement. "Budget," she repeated, the word sounding like a curiosity. "Yes, the financial aspect. I have taken the liberty of reviewing the library's endowment. In the interest of efficiency, I have redirected the restoration funds into a discretionary account. It is, of course, managed personally by me. This ensures that no one spends the funds on frivolous academic whims." Hassan blinked. "Redirected?" "But the grants were specifically earmarked for the restoration of the vellum and the repair of the shelving." "They were," Beatrix said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "And they shall be dispensed at my discretion. You will find your salary is quite comfortable, Hassan, provided your work aligns with the aesthetic and social goals I have set for the library. I expect a sanctuary of beauty, not a dusty warehouse of obsolete thoughts. Should your priorities diverge from mine, I fear your tenure here would be remarkably brief." She leaned in slightly, the threat veiled in a velvet tone. "I am the patron, Mr. Al-Rashid. The library exists because I allow it to exist. I trust we understand one another." Hassan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He studied the crumbling walls of the library, then at the fragile blue gentian, and finally at Saffron, who had retreated back into her silence, her gaze once again fixed on the earth. He had traveled thousands of miles to save these books, only to discover that he had been hired as a curator for a gilded cage, and the key was held by a woman who viewed knowledge as a mere accessory to her status. Chapter 3. Saffron's fingers trembled. the stems of the yellow roses bruising under her grip as she bound them with a length of coarse twine. She worked with a frantic, imprecise energy, her breath hitching in the humid air of the potting shed. In the language of her father's gardens, these were not merely flowers, they were a bridge. Yellow, not the gold of wealth or the crimson of passion, but the steady, quiet hue of friendship. It was a gesture of peace, a silent apology for her retreat in the presence of Mrs. Sterling, and a tentative hand extended to the boy who had once read her poetry beneath the willow trees. She glanced toward the library, where the gray stone walls seemed to lean inward, burdened by the weight of 1,000 decaying spines. The risk was a physical weight in her chest. To leave a gift was to acknowledge a bond, and in the rigid geography of their village, any acknowledgment was a vulnerability. Yet, the silence between her and Hassan had become a void she could no longer endure. She stepped across the damp grass, her boots clicking softly on the stone path, and slipped into the archive hall. The air inside smelled of old vellum and the sharp tang of dampness. Hassan was absent, likely sequestered in the upper galleries or arguing with a ledger, leaving the main desk a sanctuary of mahogany and dust. Saffron placed the bouquet exactly where he would see it, resting atop a stack of linen-bound folios, and vanished back into the garden before the echo of her footsteps could betray her. When Hassan returned, he did not see a gift, he saw a cipher. He stopped short, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he stared at the vibrant yellow petals contrasting against the muted brown of the desk. His academic mind, trained in the rigorous discipline of paleography, instinctively sought a key. He did not simply smell the roses, he analyzed them. He noted the saturation of the pigment and the precise arrangement of the petals. He stepped away from the desk and crossed to a nearby shelf, pulling down a weathered copy of The Botanist's Lexicon. He flipped through the pages with surgical precision, his finger tracing the entries until he found the section on rosaceae. He lingered on the passage regarding the yellow rose, reading the definition of platonic affection and friendship twice. He looked from the book to the flowers, a small perplexed frown creasing his brow. He wondered if the gesture was a simple courtesy or a coded message regarding the library's state. To Hassan, the world was a series of texts to be decoded, and Saffron Thorne was the most complex manuscript he had ever encountered. An hour later, he found her in the courtyard struggling with a heavy burlap sack of potting soil. The bag was oversized and leaking a fine mist of peat that clung to the damp fabric of her skirts. Saffron was leaning back, her heels digging into the soft loam, her face flushed with a concentrated effort that bordered on desperation. She refused to ask for help, her jaw set in a line of stubborn autonomy that Hassan recognized from their childhood. "The physics of the lift are against you, Saffron," Hassan said, his voice sounding too formal, too much like a lecture hall, even as his heart performed a clumsy dance in his chest. Saffron didn't look up, though her grip tightened on the burlap. "I am quite capable of managing a bag of earth, Mr. Al-Rashid." "Capability is distinct from efficiency," he replied, stepping closer. He reached down, his movements hesitant. As he grasped the other end of the heavy sack, his knuckles brushed against the rough weave of the burlap, and for a fleeting second his fingers grazed the back of her hand. The contact was electric, a sudden spark that seemed to vibrate through the humid air. Saffron froze, her breath catching in a sharp, audible hitch. Neither of them moved for a heartbeat, the weight of the soil suspended between them. Hassan felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to close the gap, to speak a truth that had been dormant for a decade, but the ghost of Mrs. Eclower. Sterling's presence seemed to linger in the periphery of the courtyard, a reminder of the social precipice upon which they stood. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant chime of the village clock. She stepped back quickly, the sudden distance feeling like a physical loss. Hassan cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "It is a significant amount of soil. I imagine the gentians will appreciate the richness." He wanted to say more, to ask if the roses were meant for him, to tell her that he had spent the last hour reading a textbook just to understand her. But the words remained locked behind his academic reserve. He watched her retreat toward the flower beds, her posture guarded, her fingers tugging rhythmically at her apron strings. Seeking refuge from his own restlessness, Hassan returned to the archives. He spent the afternoon diving into the estate records of the village, searching for the original blueprints of the library's foundation. The room was dim, lit only by the filtered light of a dying afternoon. As he pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume of land grants from the bottom shelf, something fluttered from between the pages. It was a letter, folded into a tight square and sealed with a dollop of dark red wax. The seal had partially cracked over time, the wax brittle and grayed. Hassan hesitated. The letter was not addressed to him, nor to the library. The ink on the envelope was faded, but the name was clear. It was addressed to Julian Thorne, Saffron's late husband. Curiosity, that academic vice, won over propriety. He broke the remaining seal and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was feminine, hurried, and intimate, the ink bleeding in places where the writer had pressed too hard. Hassan scanned the lines, his eyes widening as he read a fragment of a conversation that felt like a violation. The writer spoke of a mounting desperation and a debt that could not be ignored, mentioning a sum of money that far exceeded the modest means of a man like Julian Thorne. There were mentions of a secret arrangement and a price for silence that hinted at a clandestine life Saffron had never known. He read the words again, the implication settling in his gut like cold lead. If these debts were real, and if the scandal mentioned in the letter were to surface, the meager pittance Saffron relied upon, the very autonomy she fought so hard to preserve, could be stripped away in a single stroke of a lawyer's pen. Hassan looked up from the letter to the bouquet of yellow roses still sitting on the mahogany desk. The vibrant color now seemed jarring, almost naive. He thought of Saffron's trembling hands and her fierce, quiet dignity. He realized with a jolt of dread that the bridge she had tried to build with those flowers was anchored in a soil that might be poisoned. He held the letter in his hand, the secret weighing more than the bag of soil he had carried, wondering if the friendship he was rediscovering was merely a fragile veil draped over a ruin. Chapter 4. It is not a subspecies of the S. digitalis, but a divergent variation of the slinaria, Saffron whispered, her finger hovering a mere fraction of an inch above the yellowed vellum. Hassan leaned in, the scent of old paper and the faint lingering musk of dried pressed flowers enveloping them both. The volume was a behemoth of a book, bound in cracked calfskin that groaned whenever they turned a page. They were tucked into the furthest alcove of the archives, where the light filtered through high, dust-moted windows in long, slanted columns. The air here felt thick, as if the weight of 1,000 dead authors was pressing down on them, creating a sanctuary of silence that existed independently of the village outside. The morphology of the root system suggests otherwise, Hassan countered, his voice low and rhythmic, matching the hushed cadence of the room. He pointed to a meticulous copperplate engraving of a root network that looked like a map of some subterranean city. Look at the lateral spread. Acelinaria would never exhibit such a profound descent into the loam. This is a specimen designed for drought, a survivor of the arid plains. Saffron shifted, her shoulder brushing against his coat. She did not pull away. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the illustration with an intensity that bordered on the devotional. You see the anatomy, Hassan, but you forget the soil. A plant does not merely exist in a vacuum of classification, it responds to the earth it inhabits. If this were grown in the heavy clay of the valley, the roots would be stunted, but in the sandy loam of the coast, they would stretch exactly thus. Without realizing it, Hassan had mirrored her posture. He was leaning forward, his spine curved in the same tentative arc as hers, his breath hitching in time with her own. He felt a sudden sharp awareness of the distance between them, or rather, the lack of it. The academic debate, usually his shield, had become a bridge. He found himself less interested in the slinaria, and more captivated by the way Saffron's voice softened when she spoke of the earth, as if she were sharing a secret meant only for the plants. Perhaps, he conceded, his voice dropping an octave, the environment dictates the form more than the lineage. Saffron turned her head slightly. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for a sign of genuine agreement or mere politeness. In the dim light, the amber flecks in her irises seemed to glow. The silence between them stretched, no longer the silence of a library, but something taut and vibrating. Saffron reached out to trace the line of the root system once more, and Hassan's hand moved instinctively to steady the page. Their fingers collided. It was a small contact, the slide of skin against skin on the cool, textured surface of the vellum, but it felt like a thunderclap in the stillness of the archives. Neither of them moved. Hassan felt the warmth of her hand, a stark contrast to the chill of the room. For several heartbeats, the world narrowed down to that single point of contact. The debt he had discovered in the letter, the looming threat of Beatrix Sterling, the rigid expectations of their station. All of it vanished. There was only the scent of old ink and the electric, terrifying proximity of a woman who had spent years hiding in the shadows of her own garden. Oh, what a delightfully rustic scene. The voice sliced through the moment like a blade. Both Hassan and Saffron recoiled as if they had been burned, their hands snapping back to their respective sides. Farah Okoro stood at the entrance of the alcove, her posture a masterclass in performative grace. She was draped in a gown of pale primrose silk that seemed entirely too bright for the gloom of the library, her skirts billowing around her like a curated cloud. In her hand, she held a small, leather-bound social diary and a graphite pencil, which she held poised like a weapon. "Miss Farah," Hassan said, his voice suddenly stiff and formal, his hand flying to adjust his glasses. He stepped instinctively in front of Saffron, as if his physical presence could shield her from the other woman's scrutinizing gaze. "I was not aware you had an interest in botanical classification." Farah did not look at him. Her eyes were darting between Saffron's flushed face and the proximity of their chairs, her gaze calculating and cold. She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she began to scribble rapidly in her diary, the pencil scratching a rhythmic, aggressive sound against the paper. She tilted her head, a small, thin smile playing on her lips, a smile that stayed cold. Saffron had retreated. She had shrunk back into her shell, her fingers tugging violently at the strings of her apron, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. The vulnerability that had just existed between her and Hassan was gone, replaced by a palpable, shivering anxiety. "Interest? My dear Mr. Stir." "Al-Rashid, I have very little interest in the dirt," Farah replied, her voice airy and fluctuating in pitch, mimicking the latest affectations of the London season. "However, I have a profound interest in the dynamics of the village. It is so rare to see a widow of such modest circumstances spending so much intimate time in the company of a scholar. One wonders if the archives offer more than just old books." "We are discussing the morphology of this linaria," Hassan stated, his tone clipped. He felt a surge of protective irritation. "A pursuit of purely academic merit." "I trust you find the pursuit of knowledge a worthy endeavor, Miss Okoro." Farah gave a soft, melodic laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Of course. Knowledge is a powerful tool, especially when one is seeking to secure a new form of patronage. I shall be sure to note the intensity of your collaboration." She stepped closer, the scent of an overbearing artificial violet perfume filling the space. She didn't speak another word to them, but her eyes remained fixed on Saffron, documenting every tremor of the widow's hands. With a final, predatory glance, Farah turned on her heel and swept out of the alcove, the rustle of her silk skirts sounding like a warning. As she departed, a small piece of white lace fluttered to the floor, a scented handkerchief, left behind with an air of calculated negligence. But as Saffron exhaled, a shaky, jagged breath, she noticed something else. Farah had not simply dropped a handkerchief. She had left her diary open on the mahogany table beside them, the pages splayed wide. Saffron leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, on the open page, was a quick charcoal sketch. It was an unnervingly accurate rendering of her and Hassan hunched together over the book, their heads nearly touching, their silhouettes blurred in a way that suggested a scandalous intimacy. Beneath the sketch, in a sharp, looping script, were 4 words that made the blood drain from Saffron's face. The scandal of the archives. Chapter 5. The soil was cold and damp, clinging to Saffron's fingernails like a second skin, but she did not mind the grit. She worked in the center of the main garden bed, her movements precise and rhythmic, carving a shallow cradle into the earth for the Esmiosotis sylvatica. To the untrained eye, it was a mere forget-me-not, a common blue speck amidst the greenery. But Saffron had chosen this specific variety for its depth of hue and the clandestine promise it carried. In the silent lexicon of the garden, she was planting a seed of secret love, a bold floral declaration that felt, in the stillness of the morning, like a shout in a cathedral. She spent the better part of 2 hours meticulously masking the bloom. She arranged a screen of common hostas and trailing ivy around the perimeter, creating a living veil. The goal was not to hide the flower from the world entirely, but to ensure it remained invisible to those who looked only at the surface. Only someone with a scholar's eye for detail, someone who understood the patience of growth in the architecture of a leaf, would notice the deliberate gap in the greenery. Only Hassan would find it. As she pressed the last handful of loam fern, Saffron felt a strange, fluttering lightness in her chest, a sensation that threatened to override her usual caution. For a woman whose life had become a study in erasure, this small act of visibility felt like a revolution. "You are digging with a fervor that suggests you are burying a body, or perhaps planting a kingdom." A melodic voice drifted across the hedge. Saffron jolted, her hand slipping in the mud. She looked up to see Nalini Deshmukh leaning against the wrought-iron gate, her silk shawl draped with an effortless grace that always made Saffron feel as though she were made of coarse wool. Nalini's smile was a knowing thing, the kind of expression that suggested she had already read the ending of a book Saffron had only just begun to write. "I am merely tending to the perennials, Nalini," Saffron replied, though her voice lacked its usual steadiness. She wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric already stained with the dark evidence of her mourning. "The soil is particularly receptive today." Nalini stepped into the garden, her boots clicking softly on the stone path. She didn't look at the larger beds. Instead, her eyes tracked the sheltered spot where Saffron had just finished. "The soil is always receptive to those who speak its language. Tell me, is this a conversation for the public or a private correspondence?" Saffron paused, her gaze drifting to the blue petals peeking through the ivy. A soft, rhythmic hope entered her tone, her words slowing as she sought the exact phrasing. "It is a tentative inquiry. A way to signal that the silence between us is no longer a void, but a bridge. I wanted to tell him that I remember the way he used to describe the stars, and that I find the archives more welcoming since his return." Nalini laughed, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the gray Regency morning. "My dear Saffron, you are a master of the subtle, but do not let subtlety become a cage. The world is far too loud for whispers alone. Be bolder. If you wish to claim a place in his heart, you must eventually step out from behind the hostas. Happiness is a predatory thing. If you do not seize it, someone else, someone far less deserving, will surely take it from you." Saffron looked down at her muddied boots, the weight of propriety pressing back down upon her. "I cannot simply be bold. The village has a memory like a ledger, Nalini. Every transgression is recorded, and the interest is paid in reputation." "Then let them keep their ledgers," Nalini countered, her hand resting lightly on Saffron's shoulder. "There is a profound dignity in choosing one's own joy over the approval of people who view a garden as a mere accessory to a house. Your heart is not a curated exhibition, Saffron. Let it be wild." For a moment the two women stood in a shared, comfortable silence, the air smelling of damp earth and the faint, lingering scent of the rain that had passed overnight. Saffron felt a rare surge of confidence, a belief that the secret love bloom would serve as a beacon, drawing Hassan toward her in a way that words never could. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of quiet anticipation, imagining the moment his glasses would catch the shade of blue, the moment he would realize that the garden was speaking to him. When Saffron returned to the garden the following morning, the mist was still clinging to the grass in silver threads. She walked with a light step, her mind already composing the conversation she hoped would follow the discovery of the flower. But as she reached the center bed, the lightness vanished, her breath hitched. The Myosotis sylvatica had not merely wilted, it had been obliterated. The plant had been violently ripped from the soil, the roots exposed and shriveled like skeletal fingers. The delicate blue petals were no longer a beacon, they were crushed into the dark, clinging mud, trampled by a heavy heel into a bruised, unrecognizable pulp. The ivy screen she had so carefully constructed had been torn aside, leaving the site of her confession exposed and violated. Saffron sank to her knees, her fingers trembling as she touched the ruined stem. A sharp, jagged feeling of exposure washed over her, as if someone had reached into her chest and stepped on her heart. This was not the work of a stray dog or a sudden frost. This was a calculated act of erasure. The vulnerability she had allowed herself to feel the day before now felt like a liability, a wound left open for the world to see. She began to search the mud, her movements frantic, searching for any sign of who had done this. Her fingers brushed against something coarse and unnatural. Hooked deep into the remaining thorns of a nearby rosebush was a small, distinct scrap of white lace. Saffron pulled it free, the fabric delicate and expensive, featuring an intricate floral pattern that was far too costly for any servant or village girl to possess. Saffron's blood ran cold. She recognized that specific lace. It was the same trim that adorned the high collars and cuffs of Lady Beatrix Sterling's favorite morning gowns. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was not a random act of vandalism, it was a warning. Beatrix had not only seen the flower, she had seen the intent behind it. The message was clear. Saffron's private heart was under surveillance, and any attempt to cultivate a life beyond the boundaries of her station would be met with absolute destruction. Saffron remained on her knees, the scrap of lace clutched in her hand, feeling the sudden, oppressive weight of the village closing in around her. The garden, once her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. It really is a shame about the blue ones. A voice drifted from the edge of the garden, airy and fluctuating in pitch. They are such a fragile species. One wrong step, and they simply vanish. Saffron froze and turned slowly. Standing at the perimeter of the garden, framed by the gray stone wall, was Farah Okoro. She was dressed in a gown of pale primrose, her skirts perfectly smoothed, her posture a study in performative elegance. She didn't move closer, but her eyes, cold, sharp, and glittering with a predatory triumph, remained fixed on Saffron. Farah didn't smile with her lips, but her gaze held the satisfaction of a hunter who had just watched a trap snap shut. She lingered for a heartbeat longer, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a threat, and then, with a flick of her wrist, she turned and swept away, the rustle of her silk skirts sounding like the closing of a cell door. Chapter 6. The scent of ambergris and heavy lilies clung to the library's great hall, a cloying mixture that felt less like a celebration and more like a burial. Saffron stood by the mahogany wainscoting, twisting the fabric of her charcoal silk gown, a dress 5 years out of fashion and tight across the shoulders. She felt the gaze of the village elite sliding over her like a cold current, weighing her frayed hem against their shimmering satins. To them she was a ghost haunting her own life, a widow present only by the grace of the patroness. Across the room candlelight flickered in the crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows that mocked Saffron's stillness. She focused on a potted fern in the corner, noting the yellowing of the lower fronds, a sign of overwatering. It was a small, botanical failure, but the only thing in the room she felt qualified to judge. The air was thick with the snap of fans and the hum of conversations that shifted into a vacuum of silence the moment she stepped within earshot. Lady Beatrix Sterling moved toward the center of the room, the crowd parting with military precision. Draped in iridescent cream, her waist cinched to an improbable degree, she tapped a painted fan rhythmically against her palm. 3 short strikes. A silence. 3 more. It was the sound of a gavel in a courtroom where Beatrix was the sole judge, jury, and executioner. "Pray, lend me your attention," Beatrix announced, her voice a polished, artificial warmth. She stepped onto the small dais, her gaze landing with surgical precision on Saffron. "We gather tonight not merely to celebrate the restoration of our archives, but to honor the civilizing influence a well-curated library brings to a provincial outpost. Knowledge, after all, is a mirror. It reflects not only the wisdom of the ancients, but the order and propriety of the society that preserves it." Saffron felt a sharp prickle of heat climb her neck. She looked down at her scuffed leather shoes. The speech was a performance of virtue, but the subtext was a reminder of who held the keys to the kingdom. The guests remained breathless, waiting for the inevitable turn of the screw. "In the spirit of this renewed order," Beatrix continued, her tone shifting to exaggerated charity, "I have reflected on the logistical inefficiencies of our current arrangement. The gardener's quarters, while quaint, are poorly situated. To ensure a more streamlined operation, and to relieve the burden of isolation from our dear Mrs. Thorne, I have decided that the gardening staff and their residents shall be moved to the servants' wing adjacent to the kitchens. I believe Saffron will find the proximity to the domestic staff quite comforting." The silence that followed was absolute, the silence of a social execution. To move Saffron from her independent cottage to the servants' wing was a formal demotion of caste. It was a public declaration that Saffron Thorne was no longer a lady of the village, however impoverished, but a mere employee of the Sterling estate. Saffron froze, her breath hitching. She felt a violent urge to melt into the mahogany walls. Her hands gripped her apron strings, which she had forgotten to remove from her gown, and the patterns of the Persian rug blurred into a kaleidoscope of red and gold. She tried to find some shred of defiance, but her voice had retreated deep into her chest. She could hear the collective intake of breath from the crowd as they leaned in to witness the wreckage of her dignity. "A most sensible arrangement, is it not?" Beatrix asked, her eyes glittering with predatory satisfaction. "It is an absurdity." The voice sliced through the tension like a blade. Saffron looked up to see Hassan al-Rashid stepping forward from the periphery. He had been standing in the shadows, his glasses reflecting the candlelight, looking every bit the detached academic. But as he moved into the light, the passivity vanished. He invaded the space, breaking the invisible circle of the ton with a stride far too confident for a man of his social standing. He stopped a few feet from the dais, his posture rigid. When he turned to Beatrix, his expression was one of clinical observation, as if he were analyzing a flawed manuscript. "Lady Beatrix," Hassan began, his voice formal yet ringing with an intensity that made several guests recoil. While I admire your commitment to efficiency, such a move would be a catastrophic error in scholarly preservation. The archives are not merely piles of parchment, they are living entities, linked to the biological history of this region. Mrs. Bressel. Thorne's expertise in botany is not a service to be managed, but a prerequisite for the library's survival. The chemical compositions of the soil surrounding the archives influence the humidity and acidity of the lower vaults. To remove the gardener from her sanctuary is to sever the intuition required to protect the very texts you claim to cherish. He stepped closer, his voice dropping an octave. To treat the stewardship of the land as a domestic chore is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of knowledge. Saffron's role is not one of servitude, but of indispensable intellectual partnership. Without her, these archives are merely dead skin and ink. To demote her is to degrade the library itself. A collective gasp rippled through the room. To challenge Lady Beatrix in public was a social heresy. To do so using the language of intellectual superiority was an act of war. The hierarchy had been fractured in a single outburst. Saffron looked at Hassan, her heart hammering. She had never seen him like this. Not the hesitant man who spoke in soft queries, but a man who had stepped into the line of fire to shield her using the only weapon he possessed, his mind. Beatrix's face went a dangerous shade of pale, her fan frozen mid-air. The mask of benevolence slipped, revealing a raw, cold fury. She could not respond immediately. The logic of his argument had created a social stalemate she could not dismiss without appearing ignorant of her own library's needs. As the gala wound down and the guests dispersed in a flurry of hushed whispers, Beatrix waited. Once the room had emptied of all but a few stragglers, and as Hassan attempted to move toward Saffron, Beatrix stepped into his path. She reached out, her fingers gripping his sleeve with a strength that belied her delicate frame. She leaned in close, her voice a lethal whisper. "You may fancy yourself a protector of ruins, Mr. Al-Rashid, but you have forgotten that I am the one who decides which ruins are allowed to stand. You have just signed the death warrant of your professional reputation." Chapter 7. Nalini Deshmukh did not enter the village council chamber so much as she occupied it. Her presence a vibrant splash of saffron and indigo against the mahogany gloom. She stood before the council members, 5 men whose faces looked as though they had been carved from the same piece of sour apple, and leaned forward, her hands dancing through the air to punctuate a point about municipal charters. The air in the room smelled of old tobacco and damp wool, a stagnant scent that Nalini seemed to slice through with every rhythmic, melodic sentence. To designate the library as a public sanctuary is not merely an act of civic generosity, Nalini said, her voice carrying a confidence that made the councilmen shift in their heavy oak chairs. It is a legal imperative. By the very terms of the original endowment, the archives were intended for the enlightenment of the citizenry, not as a private trophy for the Sterling estate. To allow a single patron to dictate access is to invite a slow death of the village's own intellectual heritage. Saffron stood by the heavy velvet curtains, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her apron. She watched Nalini navigate the minefield of local bureaucracy with a grace Saffron could never emulate. Every time a councilman attempted to interject with a sputtered remark about Lady Beatrix's generosity, Nalini would pivot, her smile lingering just long enough to make the man feel foolish for questioning a point of law. It was a masterful performance of social chess. When the chairman finally cleared his throat and announced that the sanctuary status was upheld, a sudden, sharp lightness bloomed in Saffron's chest. The library was safe. It was no longer a plaything for Beatrix's whims, but a public trust. In the quiet of her heart, Saffron allowed herself a dangerous thought. Perhaps the sanctuary extended beyond the stone walls of the building. Perhaps the shield Nalini had provided created a space where she and Hassan could finally exist without the shadow of a social death warrant hanging over them. That afternoon, the light in the garden was a pale, buttery gold. Saffron moved through the beds with a focused intensity, her shears clipping only the most precise stems. She was composing a message, a silent confession written in petals and scent. She selected white lilies for purity, sprigs of blue cornflower for hope, and a single daring stem of red camellia to signal a longing that she dared not voice. It was a complex arrangement, a botanical vulnerability that whispered, "I trust you, and I am here." She carefully placed the bouquet in the wide stone sill of the archive window, where the glass was clouded with age, and the scent of old vellum leaked through the cracks. Inside the archives, Hassan al-Rashid stopped dead. He saw the flowers from the interior, their colors vivid against the gray stone. But he did not see a gesture of trust. His mind immediately leaped to the letter he had discovered, the jagged evidence of Julian's debts, and the clandestine arrangements that could strip Saffron of everything. To Hassan, the white lilies looked like a shroud, the red camellia felt like a warning of a bleeding wound. He read the arrangement not as an invitation, but as a signal of retreat. He convinced himself that Saffron, terrified by the potential exposure of her late husband's secrets, was marking her territory and then withdrawing behind a wall of formality. When Saffron entered the archives 10 minutes later, her spirit buoyant, she found Hassan standing at the far end of the long table. He did not look up. He was meticulously aligning a set of paleographic charts, his movements stiff and mechanical. The warmth that had defined their recent stolen moments had vanished, replaced by a cold academic distance. The council's decision was a victory for the village, Saffron said, her voice soft, searching for a crack in his armor. Indeed, Hassan replied. He did not turn. His voice was a flat line, the formal tone of a man addressing a stranger in a lecture hall. It is a commendable achievement of administrative law. I shall return to the cataloging of the 17th century manuscripts now. If you could ensure the humidity in the lower vault remained stable, I would be most grateful. Saffron froze. The precision of his words felt like a physical barrier. She watched the flowers on the sill, then at the rigid line of his shoulders. The suddenness of the shift left her breathless, a vacuum where her hope had just been. She wanted to reach out, to ask why the air between them had suddenly turned to ice, but the habit of silence was a heavy cloak. She retreated into the shadows of the stacks, her heart sinking with a weight that felt like wet earth. Driven by a restless, aching need to understand the architecture of the library she had spent years tending, Saffron began to explore the restricted shelving in the back of the archives, the areas Beatrix had strictly forbidden. She found a series of heavy, leather-bound ledgers, their spines cracked and smelling of cedar and rot. As she flipped through the pages, she didn't find poetry or history, but a ledger of payments. Detailed entries showed that Lady Beatrix had been funding the library's restoration not out of a love for knowledge, but as a targeted investment. There were specific payments made to curators to remove certain volumes, and notes on the redaction of genealogical records. Saffron traced a line of ink that detailed the removal of a family history from the 1840s, a record that contradicted the Sterling family's claim to the ancestral lands of the valley. The realization hit her with a sickening clarity. Beatrix didn't want a library, she wanted a curated narrative. She was paying to erase the truth of the village, scrubbing the archives clean of any fact that threatened her perceived nobility. The library was not a sanctuary, it was a laundry for the Sterling reputation. Saffron stepped out into the garden, the ledgers still echoing in her mind. The world felt fragile, as if the very soil beneath her boots was a lie. She found her father, Balthazar, leaning on his walking stick near the edge of the rose garden. He had been watching her, his weathered face etched with a grim understanding. He saw the tremor in her hands and the haunted look in her eyes, and he knew the library's secrets had finally leaked into her soul. He didn't ask what she had found. He simply looked out over the valley, his voice rough and stripped of all ornament. "You've got that look, Saffron. The look of a person who thinks the truth is a shield. In this village, the truth is just a target." Saffron leaned against a stone pillar, her voice a whisper. "She is erasing us, Father. All of us. She's paying to make the past disappear." Balthazar turned to her, his eyes softening, but his jaw remaining set. He reached out a calloused hand and gripped her shoulder, a rare gesture of physical grounding. He had seen the way she studied Hassan, and he had seen the way the world broke people who dared to feel too much in a place governed by the Sterlings. He wanted to protect her from the crushing weight of a hope that could not be sustained by a widow's meager means. "Listen to me," Balthazar said, his voice heavy with a heartbreaking realism. "You can chase the truth, and you can chase that man, but you must remember where you stand. We are the gardeners, Saffron. We tend the earth, we do not own it. Love is a luxury for those who can afford to be hungry." Chapter 8. The mahogany door to Lady Beatrix Sterling's study didn't so much open as it surrendered, swinging back to reveal a room that felt less like a place of business and more like a mausoleum for living things. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and a heavy, cloying musk that clung to the velvet draperies, which were drawn tight against the afternoon sun. Beatrix sat behind a desk of polished ebony, her spine a rigid line that mirrored the geometry of the room. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she continued to write with a silver-nibbed pen, the scratching of the ink on parchment, the only sound in the oppressive silence. "Sit, Mr. Al-Rashid," she said, her voice a thin blade of forced kindness. She finally looked up, her eyes two cold chips of flint. She didn't gesture to the chair so much as she acknowledged its existence. "I have spent the morning reviewing the budget for the archives. It is a precarious thing, is it not? The fragility of paper, the volatility of funding. One misplaced decimal, one sudden change in patronage, and a lifetime of scholarship vanishes into the ether." Hassan felt the familiar urge to adjust his glasses, but he forced his hands to remain still at his sides. The room felt smaller than it had 5 minutes ago. "The restoration is progressing, my lady. The genealogy records are—" "I am not interested in the progress of the ink," Beatrix interrupted, the clip of her words sharp enough to draw blood. She set the pen down with a precise click. "I am interested in the progress of your associations. It has come to my attention that you have developed a most peculiar habit of frequenting the garden of the late Mr. Thorne. A widow's garden is a place for mourning, not for the leisure of a returning scholar. It is a boundary that should not be crossed, not only for the sake of propriety, but for the stability of your own position here." Hassan shifted, the fabric of his coat feeling suddenly too tight across his shoulders. "Miss Thorne is a childhood acquaintance, and her knowledge of the local flora is indispensable to the—" "Do not mistake my patience for ignorance," Beatrix said, her head tilting in that slight, judgmental manner that suggested he was a specimen under a microscope. She leaned forward, the movement slow and predatory. "Let us be excruciatingly clear. You are here by my grace. The funds that keep those archives from rotting into mulch are mine. My connections in London, the curators at the British Museum, the Fellows of the Royal Society, they all answer to the sterling name. Should I decide that your presence in this village is no longer an asset, I can ensure that your academic career is not merely paused, but erased. You would find yourself a pariah in every library from here to Oxford." Hassan felt a cold numbness creep from his fingertips up his arms. The threat was not a blunt instrument. It was a surgical strike. His life's work, the years spent in dusty vaults, the obsessive pursuit of lost texts, the very identity he had forged in the absence of a family, was balanced on the edge of this woman's whim. He watched the ebony desk, the silver pen, the suffocating velvet, and he saw the bars of a cage. If he complied, he would save the archives. He would save his name. He would simply have to excise Saffron from his heart, as if she were a corrupted line of text in an ancient manuscript. He stood in the silence for a moment, his mind racing through the logic of survival. Is a career worth the silence of a soul, he wondered? He thought of the archives, the smell of old vellum, and the thrill of discovery. Then, unbidden, he remembered the sound of Saffron's voice, that soft, rhythmic cadence that felt like the slow unfolding of a leaf in spring. He remembered the way she tugged at her apron strings when she was unsure, and the way she studied a flower not as a specimen, but as a secret. The realization hit him with a physical force. The archives were dead things, preserved in salt and ink, but Saffron was alive. To choose the library over her would be to choose the curator's case over the garden. "I see," Hassan said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "Your terms are quite explicit." "They are," Beatrix replied, already returning her attention to her papers, the dismissal implicit in the movement. "I trust you have the sense to prioritize your future over a momentary lapse in judgment. You may go." Hassan exited the study, but he did not return to the archives. Instead, he walked with a feverish intensity toward the edge of the village, his boots crunching on the gravel. He spent the remainder of the evening in a state of focused agitation. He did not reach for his books or his paleography tools. Instead, he went to the potting shed, his hands shaking as he gripped the handle of a heavy iron spade. He began to dig, not with the precision of a scholar, but with the desperation of a man who had just burned his only bridge and found he liked the heat of the fire. He spent hours in the damp earth, gathering the most provocative specimens he could find. He bypassed the modest daisies and the cautious lilies. He sought the riotous, the forbidden, the explicit. He gathered deep, blood-red roses, their thorns tearing at his palms. He sought out the tangled, exotic passion flowers that looked like crowns of fire. He added sprigs of red hyacinth and the bold, unapologetic crimson of the gladiolus. He worked through the twilight, the dirt staining his cuffs and his fingernails, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was no longer translating a dead language. He was inventing a new one. By the time the moon had climbed high over the valley, Hassan had constructed a floral arrangement that was less a bouquet and more a scream. It was a chaotic, vivid explosion of red and purple, a violent contrast to the muted grays and greens of the garden path. He placed the arrangement directly beneath Saffron's window, where the moonlight would hit the crimson petals and make them glow like embers. In the secret language of floriography, it was an admission of everything, passion, longing, and a total, reckless devotion that ignored every rule of the ton. As he stepped back to survey his work, his chest heaving, he felt a sudden chilling sensation of being watched. He looked up toward the Sterling Manor, perched on the hill like a vulture. There, on the high stone balcony, stood the silhouette of Lady Beatrix. She was a dark smudge against the pale stone, and even from this distance he could see the rhythmic, slow motion of her hand. She was tapping her fan against her palm, a slow, murderous beat that sounded, in his mind, like a gavel coming down. He had done it. He had traded the security of his profession, the respect of his peers, and the stability of his future for a collection of dying stems and a gamble on a woman who might still be terrified of the world. He studied the red roses, then back at the balcony, and realized that the war for the village had shifted. He was no longer a guest or a scholar. He was a combatant. He stood in the dirt, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, waiting for the dawn to reveal whether Saffron would see the flowers as a lifeline or a liability. Chapter 9. The dew had not yet evaporated from the grass when Saffron pushed open the casement window, the hinges giving a sharp, rusted protest that echoed through the morning stillness. She froze. Below her, resting against the damp stone of the cottage wall, lay a riot of color that looked as though a piece of a tropical jungle had been violently transplanted into the gray English dawn. The red roses were not the polite pale pinks of a tea garden. They were the color of fresh arterial blood, deep and bruising. Beside them, the passion flowers curled like exotic crowns, their intricate filaments reaching upward, paired with the unapologetic, jagged spears of crimson gladiolus. Saffron's breath hitched, her fingers tightening on the wooden sill until the grain bit into her skin. She did not need to consult a lexicon. She had been raised in the dirt and the scent of crushed stems. This was not a gesture of friendship, nor a tentative inquiry of affection. This was a scream. It was a reckless, public declaration of a passion so absolute that it bordered on the sacrilegious. Hassan had not merely spoken to her, he had thrown his entire reputation into the mud at her feet. A sudden, dizzying warmth flooded her chest, a feeling of being seen, truly seen, that made her feel dangerously exposed. For a moment, the world narrowed to the scent of those roses, a heavy, cloying perfume that drowned out the smell of old paper and mourning wool. Saffron. The voice was a rough snap that shattered the silence. Saffron recoiled from the window, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned to find her father, Balthazar, standing in the doorway. He was not wearing his gardening smock, but his formal coat, the wool frayed at the cuffs. His face, usually a map of weathered contentment, was drawn and grim, his knuckles rubbing together in a slow, anxious friction. He didn't look at her. He studied the floor, his gaze fixed on a loose floorboard. "What has happened, father?" Saffron asked, her voice sounding thin and distant to her own ears. She instinctively reached for her apron strings, tugging them tight, a physical attempt to anchor herself. "Lady Beatrix," Balthazar said, his voice dropping an octave. "She has sent word through the steward. The library cottages are to be cleared. She claims the restoration requires specialized quarters for the visiting consultants from London. You are to vacate by the end of the month, Saffron. She is exercising her right as the primary patron." The room seemed to tilt. Saffron felt the air vanish from the space, replaced by a cold, suffocating vacuum. The library cottages were not merely housing. They were the perimeter of her sanctuary, the only place where the village's judgmental eyes could not reach her. To be evicted was to be cast out into the open, a widow with no protector and a dwindling purse, entirely at the mercy of a woman who viewed her as a smudge on a polished mirror. The joy of the flowers evaporated, replaced by a crushing sense of guilt. Hassan had risked everything for her, and in return the world was closing in. "She cannot simply throw me out," Saffron whispered, though she knew the legalities of the estate were a labyrinth designed to trap people like her. "She can," Balthazar replied, finally looking at her. His eyes were clouded with a mixture of pity and frustration. "And she will. Unless you find a way to make yourself indispensable to her, or a way to leave this village entirely. The seasonal assembly is in 2 weeks, Saffron. Once the guest lists are finalized and the social order is reset, there will be no one left to plead your case. You will be a ghost in your own home." Balthazar left her then, his footsteps heavy and slow, leaving a silence that felt like a physical weight. Saffron did not cry. Instead, she walked out into the garden, her movements mechanical. She bypassed the neatly trimmed hedges and the orderly beds of lavender, drifting toward the wilder edges of the plot. The sky began to bruise, shifting from a pale gray to a heavy, oppressive indigo. Then the rain began. Not a gentle mist, but a sudden, violent downpour that soaked through her thin cotton dress in seconds. She collapsed onto the damp earth, her knees sinking into the loam. She didn't move as the rain washed the salt from her cheeks. She lay there, the scent of crushed mint and wet soil filling her nostrils, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She thought of the red roses beneath her window and the sheer, terrifying bravery of the man who had placed them there. Hassan had stepped out of the shadows of the archives to stand in the light, and she, in her terror, had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing. She realized then that her silence had not been a shield, it had been a shroud. By refusing to fight, she had made herself an easy target for Beatrix's cruelty. "You look remarkably like a drowned rat, Saffron. It is a bold-fashioned choice, even for a widow." Saffron bolted upright, wiping mud from her forehead. Nalini stood under a wide, black silk umbrella, her expression a mixture of amusement and sharp intensity. She didn't offer a hand to help Saffron up. Instead, she stood there, a pillar of poise amidst the chaos of the storm. "I have lost everything," Saffron said, her voice shaking. "The cottage, the gardens, Beatrix has won." Nalini stepped closer, the umbrella tilting to shield Saffron from the worst of the deluge. "Beatrix hasn't won. She has merely defined the board. You are playing a game of propriety and submission, and you are losing because you are actually trying to follow the rules. The rules were written by women like Beatrix to ensure that women like you never leave the dirt." "I cannot fight her," Saffron whispered, looking down at her muddy hands. "I don't have the voice for it." "Then stop using your voice," Nalini countered, her eyes flashing. "You are the most skilled botanist in this county. You speak a language that Beatrix cannot translate, but will certainly feel. If you want to survive the assembly, you cannot go as a supplicant. You cannot go as the grieving widow begging for her home. You must go as a threat." Nalini reached into her pocket and produced a cream-colored envelope. The invitation to the seasonal assembly, embossed with the sterling crest. She dropped it onto the wet grass between them. The assembly is where the village's social hierarchy is cemented for the year. It is a theater of performance. If you wish to keep your sanctuary, you must give the audience a performance they will never forget. Saffron looked at the invitation, then at the dark, rain-slicked garden around her. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it a spark of something else had ignited. It was a hot, sharp defiance, born from the realization that there was nothing left to lose. She thought of Hassan's red roses, the violence of their color, the audacity of their placement. He had stopped translating the past and had begun to write the present. Slowly, Saffron stood up. She ignored the mud clinging to her skirts and the chill in her limbs. She turned away from the cottage and walked toward the furthest, most overgrown corner of the garden, where the plants grew thick and rebellious. She began to move through the brush, her eyes searching not for the elegant or the refined, but for the subversive. She sought the monkshood with its poisonous elegance, the nightshade with its deceptive berries, and the deep, bruised purples of the black hellebore. She didn't gather them with the care of a gardener. She harvested them with the precision of an armorer. As she tied the stems together with a piece of rough twine, she felt the shift in her own spirit. She was no longer assembling a bouquet, she was constructing a weapon. She would attend the assembly, and she would bring with her a floral arrangement that would strip the mask of propriety from Lady Beatrix's face in front of the entire ton. The silence was over. The war had begun. Chapter 10. The Sterling Ballroom was a study in monochrome restraint. The walls were a pale, suffocating cream, and the guests moved like slow-motion ghosts in a sea of muted grays, pale blues, and the heavy, oppressive blacks of those still performing their grief. At the center of this curated stillness stood Beatrix Sterling, her spine a rigid line of steel, her gaze sweeping the room with the clinical precision of a general inspecting a failing garrison. She held her fan with a grip that suggested she might use it to strike anyone who dared breathe out of tempo, her head tilted at that familiar judgmental angle that reduced every guest to a mere curiosity in her collection. Saffron did not enter the room so much as she disrupted it. The heavy oak doors groaned open, and for a heartbeat, the music, a timid string quartet playing something predictably safe, seemed to falter. Saffron was not wearing the charcoal silk of a widow, nor the subdued lavender of a woman seeking forgiveness. She wore a gown of deep, mossy green that clung to her frame with a quiet strength, but it was the arrangement pinned to her bodice and trailing from her wrist that froze the room. It was a violent, beautiful collision of botany, the bruised midnight purple of black hellebore, the poisonous elegance of monkshood, and the searing, arrogant red of roses that looked as though they had been plucked from a fever dream. It was not a bouquet, it was a manifesto written in petals and thorns. As Saffron crossed the polished marble floor, the silence rippled outward from her like a stone cast into a stagnant pond. The gasps were not loud, for propriety forbade such things, but they were visceral, sharp intakes of breath that sounded like a collective shudder. The guests leaned away from her, as if the arrangement were contagious. Hassan, standing near the periphery of the room, did not move. His glasses caught the light of the chandeliers, and his posture, usually so hesitant, suddenly mirrored Saffron's own. He did not look at the crowd, he looked only at her, his expression one of profound, terrified admiration. Beatrix Sterling's fan stopped its rhythmic tapping. The sound of its closure was like a pistol shot in the sudden vacuum of the room. She stepped forward, the silk of her gown hissing against the floor, her face a mask of forced kindness that failed to reach her eyes. "My dear Saffron," Beatrix said, her voice a clipped, high-altitude wind, "I see you have mistaken the seasonal assembly for a village fair. This display is remarkably vulgar. One wonders if your grief has finally clouded your judgment, or if you simply find the concept of station so tedious that you've decided to abandon it entirely. It is entirely unbecoming of a woman in your position." Saffron stopped 3 feet from the matriarch. She did not tug at her apron strings, for she wore no apron, and she did not look at the floor. She looked directly into Beatrix's eyes, her gaze steady and clear. When she spoke, the softness was gone, replaced by a rhythmic cadence that carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "Position is a curious thing, Lady Beatrix," Saffron replied, her voice resonating with a strength that seemed to surprise even herself. "You speak of station as if it were a mountain we are born upon, rather than a fence you have built to keep others out. This arrangement is not vulgar, it is honest. The monkshood speaks of caution, the hellebore of scandal, and the roses. Well, the roses speak of a truth that does not require your permission to exist." Beatrix's lip curled, her fan tightening in her hand. "You are overstepping, Saffron. You are a guest in this village by the grace of the patronage that sustains your late husband's name." "Patronage," Saffron countered, stepping closer, the scent of the bruised flowers filling the space between them. "Is that what you call the systematic erasure of our history?" "I have seen the archives, Beatrix. I have seen the letters you suppressed and the records you pruned to ensure the Sterling name remained the only one of consequence. You did not preserve the library, you curated a mirror. You have spent years silencing the voices of this village to ensure your own voice is the only one that echoes. You call my flowers vulgar, yet there is nothing more vulgar than a lie dressed in silk." The room shifted. It was a subtle movement at first, a tilt of a head here, a whispered confidence there, but the power dynamic had fundamentally fractured. The guests were no longer looking at Saffron as a social pariah. They were looking at Beatrix as a fraud. The propriety Beatrix had used as a weapon for decades was suddenly revealed for what it was, a cage designed to protect her own fragility. The silence that followed was no longer one of respect, but of a slow, creeping ridicule. Hassan moved then. He did not hesitate or glance toward the exit. He walked through the crowd, his stride purposeful, and came to a stop beside Saffron. In a gesture that shattered every remaining rule of the evening, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers in a public, undeniable claim. He knew that by doing so, he was forfeiting the academic endorsements Beatrix controlled, tossing his prestige into the fire for the sake of a woman who spoke in flowers. "I find the arrangement exquisite," Hassan said, his voice formal but infused with a warmth that made the room feel cold. "It is the first honest thing I have seen in this house." Beatrix stood frozen. Her face had gone a ghastly shade of gray, the color of the dresses she had forced upon the room. She studied their joined hands, then at the faces of her peers, and realized that the theater of her power had collapsed. The audience had stopped believing in the play. In a sudden, spasmodic motion, her hand tightened too far, and there was a sharp, dry snaps. The delicate ivory ribs of her fan splintered, the silk tearing down the middle. She stood there, clutching the broken remains of her authority, a figure of sudden, pathetic isolation in the center of her own ballroom. 2 weeks later, the silence of the library gardens was no longer a shield, but a celebration. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and reckless growth. The meticulously manicured hedges of the Sterling era had been allowed to soften, their edges blurring into a riot of unconventional colors. Foxgloves surged upward in towering spires of speckled crimson, and climbing nightbloom scent draped itself over the stone arches like a living curtain. Saffron stood by the central fountain, her hands stained with the dark rich loam of the beds. She was wearing a simple linen dress, her hair escaping its pins in a way that would have horrified the assembly. Beside her, Hassan was reading a restored manuscript, though he spent more time looking at Saffron than the vellum. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in shards of gold and emerald, dancing across the pages of his book. He closed the volume and stepped toward her, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. He didn't speak, he simply reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Saffron leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. They stood together in the center of the wildness, two people who had traded the safety of the shore for the uncertainty of the current. Around them, the garden continued to bloom. Not in the disciplined rows of a curated exhibition, but in the beautiful, chaotic surge of something that had finally been allowed to breathe. Chapter 1. The carriage wheel sank into a slurry of gray mud with a sound like a wet gasp, jolting Elias Thorne forward against the leather upholstery. He did not wait for the driver to descend. He stepped out into the damp air of the lakeside valley, his polished boots immediately surrendering to the mire. He did not look at the mud. Instead, his gaze locked onto the silhouette of Willowmere, a skeletal remains of a manor that seemed to be folding into itself under the weight of a century of neglect. He crossed the porch with a measured stride, his breath hitching as he reached the railing. Without thinking, Elias extended his index finger and traced a hard, straight line through the thick layer of grit and dead insects coating the mahogany. The friction was grounding, the line was absolute. In a world of sagging eaves and rotting timber, the line was the only thing that remained true. He stood there for a moment, the silence of the estate pressing against his ears, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the lake hitting the shoreline. From his portfolio, he withdrew the blueprints. They were masterpieces of precision, inked in a deep, unwavering black on heavy vellum, every angle calculated to the millimeter. He held the papers up, aligning the edge of the drawing with the horizon of the east wing. The discrepancy was a physical blow. Where the blueprint demanded a sharp, perpendicular rise, the actual stone leaned at a nauseating 5-degree tilt. The roofline didn't just sag, it billowed like a dying lung. Elias felt a sudden, sharp spike of heat climb his neck, a constriction in his chest that mirrored the rigidity of the projects that had cost him his reputation in London. The house was not merely decaying, it was lying to him. He pushed through the front doors, the iron hinges screaming in a pitch that set his teeth on edge. The foyer was a cavern of gray light and floating motes. He set his transit level on the floor, attempting to map the primary axis of the hall, but the instrument betrayed him. The floorboards had buckled into a series of gentle, undulating waves, rendering his measurements useless. He tried to shut the heavy oak door behind him to block the wind, but the frame had shifted. The door stopped 2 inches short of the latch, leaving a gap that allowed a sliver of the gray afternoon to bleed into the room. As he leaned in to inspect the hinge, a scent hit him. Beneath the expected smell of damp cedar and the alkaline tang of old plaster, there was something aggressive and cloying. It was a heavy, honeyed sweetness. Night-blooming night-bloom scent, perhaps, or some mutated variant of a tropical vine. The smell didn't drift in from the gardens. It seemed to be exhaled by the very walls, pulsing from the gaps in the wainscoting as if the house were breathing through a floral mask. It was a scent of misplaced vitality, an organic intrusion into a space that should have been sterile in its death. Elias moved toward the center of the room, where the main supporting pillar stood. He stopped abruptly. A hairline fracture ran from the capital down to the plinth, jagged and deep. He stepped closer, his finger hovering just millimeters from the crack. He didn't touch it, he simply calculated. He visualized the load-bearing vectors, the distribution of weight from the upper galleries, and the inevitable failure of the limestone. The math was cold and absolute. The pillar was no longer supporting the house, it was merely delaying the inevitable. Willowmere was a mathematical disaster, a structure that had forgotten the laws of gravity. He retreated to the terrace, desperate for the clarity of open air. The stone terrace, once a triumph of Georgian symmetry, was now a battlefield. Vines, thick woody ropes of ivy, and something darker, more predatory, had scaled the balustrades. He reached out to clear a path, gripping a thick stem to pull it away from the masonry. He tugged, then strained, his knuckles whitening. The vine did not snap. It was not merely clinging to the stone, it was woven into the mortar, threading through the joints with a deliberate geometric intentionality. It looked less like natural growth and more like a living reinforcement, as if the plants had decided to become the architecture where the stone had failed. He stepped off the terrace and wandered toward the perimeter of the estate, his boots clicking on a surface that suddenly shifted from mud to stone. He stopped. Beneath a canopy of weeping willows, a narrow path emerged from the brush. It was paved in crushed slate, the gray shards packed tight and level. There was no moss here, no encroaching weed. The edges were crisp, the surface swept clean. It was a ribbon of order cutting through the chaos of the wild garden, maintained with a devotion that bordered on the obsessive. Elias pulled the 18th century blueprints from his portfolio again, unfolding the large-scale map of the grounds. He scanned the area around the eastern perimeter, his eyes darting between the vellum and the slate path. He traced the original lines of the pleasure gardens and the formal hedges. There was nothing. No path, no walkway, no indication that anyone had ever existed in this quadrant of the estate. The path was a ghost, a structural anomaly that defied the historical record of the house. Following the slate path deeper into the greenery, he came to a small wrought iron gate that guarded a hidden courtyard. The iron was rusted to a deep orange, but the gate post remained sturdy. As he leaned in to examine the hinge, he saw it, a small, fresh carving in the wood of the post. It was a botanical symbol, a stylized leaf intertwined with a circle etched with a precision that rivaled his own drafting tools. The cut was clean, the sap still weeping from the wood in tiny amber beads. Someone had been here. Someone had been altering the geometry of Willowmere, not with blueprints and stone, but with soil and seed, creating a secret architecture that Elias had not authorized and could not yet understand. Chapter 2. The pruning shears snapped shut with a metal-sharp finality that echoed through the hidden courtyard. Amara did not look up as the rhythmic crunch of boots on slate announced an intruder. She focused instead on a dead limb of the climbing hydrangea, slicing through the gray wood with surgical precision, removing the decay before it could poison the healthy stem. She felt the vibration of the cut in her wrist, a grounding sensation that anchored her to the damp earth. Then came the voice, clipped and sharp as a razor, cutting through the humid silence of the garden. "Who authorized this?" Elias Thorne demanded. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, his posture as rigid as the blueprints he likely held in his grip. His coat was a charcoal wool that looked suffocatingly heavy for the afternoon heat, and his eyes, narrowed and calculating, were currently scanning the greenery as if it were a structural failure. He didn't look at Amara so much as he looked through her, his gaze fixed on the sprawling trellis that had claimed the eastern wall of the ruins. Amara finally straightened, her fingers stained a deep, loamy brown. She didn't offer a greeting. The air between them was already charged with the friction of two opposing philosophies. "The garden authorizes itself, Mr. Thorne. It follows the logic of the sun and the slope of the land, regardless of what a piece of vellum might dictate." Elias stepped forward, his boots clicking with a precision that felt aggressive. He pointed a gloved finger at the hydrangea, which had woven itself into the limestone mortar of the ruins. "This is an encroachment. From a structural standpoint, the root systems are compromising the integrity of the foundation. You have a biological infestation masquerading as a landscape. The lateral pressure exerted by these vines is creating a shear stress on the masonry that no amount of natural logic can justify. It is an architectural heresy." Amara let out a low, melodic laugh that stayed cold. She stepped toward him, the scent of crushed mint and damp peat clinging to her skin. "You speak of the house as if it were a corpse to be embalmed. Your blueprints are nothing more than the skeleton of a dead man, Mr. Thorne. You wish to freeze Willowmere in a moment of imagined perfection, but the earth doesn't care for your symmetry. It cares for breath. It cares for the way the ivy holds the stones together when the mortar has long since turned to dust." "The ivy is a parasite," Elias countered, his voice tightening. He began to pace the perimeter of the trellis, his finger tracing an imaginary straight line in the air, a habit of mental drafting. "It obscures the light, it traps moisture against the stone, and it creates a visual clutter that destroys the intended proportion of the facade. This trellis, specifically, is an affront. It obscures the primary window of the west wing, ruining the axial alignment of the entire courtyard. It must be excised. Immediately." Amara moved with a suddenness that caught him off guard, stepping directly into his path. She was smaller than him, but she occupied the space with a territorial intensity that stopped him dead. She rubbed her soil-stained palms together, a slow, grinding motion that spoke of a deep, visceral connection to the ground beneath them. "You will not touch this trellis. It was planted by someone who understood that the house is not a monument to be admired, but a living thing that must be sheltered. If you tear this down, you expose the limestone to the wind and the rain. You will accelerate the collapse you claim to be preventing." Elias looked down at her, his intellectual arrogance flaring. He didn't see a gardener. He saw a variable that needed to be managed, a smudge on a clean drawing. "I am the architect of record for the restoration of this estate. My authority is absolute. Now, step aside, or I shall mark the trellis for demolition myself." He attempted to push past her, not with violence, but with the dismissive confidence of a man used to moving obstacles. He reached out to shove aside a heavy branch of nightbloom scent that blocked his trajectory toward the wall, but Amara reached for the same branch at the same instant. Their hands collided, skin meeting skin in a sudden, jarring impact. The touch was electric. It wasn't the gentle brush of a social greeting, but a sharp, visceral spark that seemed to jump from her calloused palm to his polished skin. The world around them narrowed to that single point of contact. The hostility that had fueled their argument vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Elias froze, his breath hitching in his throat. He had spent years insulating himself behind calculations in cold stone, but the warmth of her hand felt like a breach in his fortifications. For a heartbeat, he forgot the axial alignment, the shear stress, and the structural heresy. He felt only the pulse of another human being, raw and unquantified. Amara pulled away sharply, as if burned. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a trembling hand, her eyes wide and guarded. The melodic quality of her voice had vanished, replaced by a brittle, defensive edge. "You think you can map this place, Mr. Thorne. You think if you measure every stone, you own the truth of it. But the garden knows more than the house. It remembers who walked these paths before the ruins became a project. I suggest you learn to listen to the silence before you decide what to destroy." She turned her back on him and walked toward the far end of the courtyard, her movements hurried, leaving Elias standing alone amidst the scent of night bloom scent and damp earth. He remained motionless, staring at his palm. His obsessive need for control, the very engine that had driven his career and caused its collapse, felt momentarily shattered. He could not calculate the sensation that had just occurred. There was no formula for the way his skin still tingled where she had touched him. He felt exposed, as if the garden had peeled back a layer of his carefully constructed armor. High above, partially obscured by the heavy drape of a willow tree, Zoya Volkov watched the entire exchange through a pair of ivory-handled opera glasses. Her face was a mask of pinched curiosity, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen the collision of hands, the sudden freeze, and the subsequent frantic retreat. In the rigid social hierarchy of the village, such proximity between a gentleman of Thorne's standing and a woman of the soil was more than a curiosity. It was a liability. Zoya lowered the glasses and reached into the pocket of her silk gown, retrieving a small, leather-bound ledger. With a precise, fluttering motion of her wrist, she scribbled a note in a tight, cramped hand. She did not record the beauty of the garden or the tension of the argument. She recorded the duration of the touch and the expression on Elias's face. This was the first entry in a dossier she had begun for Lady Beatrice Sterling, a collection of leverage points designed to ensure the estate was liquidated. As Zoya closed the book with a soft snap, she smiled. The architecture of the house might be crumbling, but the architecture of a scandal was just beginning to take shape. Chapter 3. The ink on the ledger was still wet, a series of rigid columns calculating the cost of seasoned oak beams and iron reinforcements. Elias sat at a trestle table in the foyer, the only piece of furniture that didn't seem to be actively surrendering to the damp. He was tracing the line of a joist in his mind, mentally subtracting the decay from the original structural intent, when the silence of the house was punctured. It was a rhythmic, sharp sound, the staccato tap of a folding fan against a wrist. He did not need to look up to know that the perimeter of his sanctuary had been breached. The sound was a signature, as precise and aggressive as a metronome. When he finally lifted his gaze, Lady Beatrice Sterling stood in the center of the foyer, her presence a jarring contrast to the peeling wallpaper and the scent of wet slate. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered like a beetle's wing, and her expression was one of curated tragedy. She did not wait for an invitation, she simply occupied the space, her eyes sweeping over the exposed laths of the ceiling with a look of profound pity. "My dear Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice theatrical, projecting to the furthest corners of the hollow hall. "I had heard the estate was in a state of decline, but I find myself quite overwhelmed. It is not a house, it is a memento mori. One half expects to find a skeletal remain in every cupboard." Elias felt a sudden sharp constriction in his chest. His hand flew to his left cufflink, twisting the small gold stud with a frantic precision. He stood slowly, his chair scraping harshly against the grit-covered floor. "Lady Beatrice, I was unaware that Willowmere had become a public gallery for the morbid. To what do I owe this intrusion?" Beatrice did not answer immediately. She began to circle him, her movements slow and predatory, the silk of her skirts hissing against the floor. The fan continued its rhythmic tap-tap-tap-tap against her wrist. Intrusion is such a harsh word. I prefer to think of it as a visitation of mercy. You are a man of ambition, Elias. I remember you in the city, the wonderkind of the new neoclassicism. It would be a tragedy to see that ambition buried under a mountain of rotting timber and ancestral pride. Elias tightened his grip on the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He forced his voice into a clipped, technical monotone, the only shield he possessed. The structural integrity is compromised, yes, but the foundation remains sound. The subsidence is localized. With the correct application of load-bearing reinforcements and a rigorous schedule of masonry repair, the house is entirely salvageable. It is a matter of engineering, not sentiment. Lady Beatrice stopped her pacing. She studied him, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the distance between his current desperation and his former glory. Engineering is a costly mistress, and you, I suspect, are bankrupt in more ways than one. Your reputation in the city is a ruin far more extensive than this house. Who is funding this fantasy, Elias? The ghosts of your forefathers? She reached into a small beaded reticule and withdrew a piece of parchment, unfolding it with a slow, deliberate flourish. I am prepared to offer you a sum that would not only clear your outstanding debts, but provide you with a comfortable residence in London, far from the damp and the smell of failure. A buyout. Clean, immediate, and discreet. You would leave Willowmere to those who can actually afford to erase its stains. Elias stared at the figure written on the paper. The number was staggering. It was a golden handcuff, a way to buy back his social standing and erase the shame of his collapsed projects in a single stroke. For a moment, the logic of the transaction screamed at him. It was the rational choice. It was the precise choice. But as he watched the paper, he smelled it again, that strange, honeyed scent exhaling from the walls, the same scent that had clung to Amara's skin. He thought of the secret courtyard, the botanical carvings that defied every blueprint he had ever studied. To sell the estate was to hand over the mystery to a woman who viewed nature as something to be paved over. He pushed the paper back toward her, his lip curling. Your generosity is as calculated as your timing, Lady Beatrice. However, you mistake my current circumstances for weakness. I intend to restore Willowmere to a standard of perfection that you cannot even conceive of. I will not have it turned into a sterilized monument to your vanity. Beatrice did not look offended. Instead, a thin, cold smile touched her lips. She paused strategically, letting the silence stretch until the air felt heavy. Perfection is a lovely sentiment, but perfection requires time, and time is a luxury you do not possess. She tapped her fan once more, the sound echoing like a gabble. I spent my morning with the county solicitors. It seems your father was a man of many passions, but few payments. There is a forgotten lien on this property, a debt of honor and coin that has lingered in the shadows for 2 decades. Elias froze. The cufflink in his hand felt suddenly cold. That is impossible. The title was clear. The title is a fiction, Beatrice replied softly, her voice now devoid of theatricality and replaced with a sharp, clinical edge. The legal loophole is quite specific. Because the lien remained unpaid, a third party, specifically the holder of the debt, may claim the land if the primary residence remains uninhabitable for a period of 6 consecutive months. It is a clause designed to prevent the decay of the landed gentry's assets. She leaned in closer, the scent of her heavy perfume clashing with the damp earth of the house. The clock began ticking the moment you stepped foot back on this soil, Elias. If you cannot make this house habitable, meaning a roof that does not leak, a hearth that draws, and a structure that passes a magistrate's inspection, by the autumn equinox, the estate is liquidated, and I am the one holding the debt. Elias felt the world tilt. The architectural precision he craved had been turned into a weapon against him. He was no longer merely fighting the rot of the wood or the aggression of the vines. He was fighting a deadline. The house had become a countdown. Lady Beatrice folded her fan with a sharp snap that sounded like a bone breaking. "I shall leave you to your calculations, Mr. Thorne. I suggest you start with the roof. It would be a shame to be evicted during a rainstorm." She turned and swept out of the foyer, her emerald skirts vanishing into the gray light of the afternoon. Elias remained standing by the trestle table, his gaze drifting upward. He studied the crumbling ceiling where the plaster hung in jagged sheets like frozen waterfalls. He could see the beams, the sheer stress of the weight above, and for the first time, the mathematical disaster of the house felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He was an architect of ruins, and he had exactly 6 months to build a miracle before the walls closed in for good. Chapter 4. The drafting table was a scarred expanse of oak, cluttered with vellum sheets and a brass compass that had seen better decades. Amara moved through the dust-moted silence of the study with a lightness that bordered on the spectral. In her arms, she carried a bundle of white lilies and yellow roses, their stems stripped of thorns and bound with a simple piece of twine. She did not simply place them, she arranged them. The lilies were positioned to lean slightly toward the center, while the yellow roses formed a soft, protective perimeter around the ivory petals. To any passing servant, it was a mere gesture of decoration. To someone versed in the silent language of the garden, it was a white flag of truce, a confession that the soil and the stone might find a way to coexist without one strangling the other. Elias entered the room 3 minutes later, the scent of old ink and damp limestone clinging to his coat. He stopped abruptly, his boots clicking once on the floorboards. He did not smile. He did not thank her. Instead, he leaned over the table, his gaze narrowing as he studied the bouquet. He shifted his weight, tracing the perimeter of the arrangement with his index finger, though he never actually touched the petals. He was searching for the symmetry, the golden ratio, or perhaps a geometric progression that would explain why these specific blooms had been chosen. He studied the lilies, then the roses, then back to the lilies, his brow furrowed in a struggle to map the organic chaos onto a grid. "The distribution is irregular," he said, his voice clipped and precise, though he didn't look up. "There is no central axis to the grouping. Why are the roses clustered on the eastern quadrant?" Amara leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her linen apron. She watched the way he fought with the flowers, treating a peace offering like a structural flaw in a blueprint. "Perhaps they simply wanted to lean that way, Mr. Thorne. Plants are not drafting tools. They do not follow a ruler." "Everything follows a rule, Miss Okoro," he replied, finally looking at her. The hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a genuine, almost childlike confusion. "Even the most erratic growth is governed by biological imperatives. I simply cannot find the logic in this particular arrangement." Amara felt a flicker of amusement, a warmth that settled in her chest. She stepped further into the room, the smell of the lilies filling the gap between them. "The logic is not mathematical. It is emotional. The white is for the ceasefire, and the yellow is for the shared ground. It is a conversation, not a calculation." Elias looked back at the flowers. He seemed to be weighing her words against his own internal library of definitions. He didn't acknowledge the sentiment, but he didn't move the bouquet. He reached out and adjusted his cufflink, a habitual twitch of his fingers that signaled a momentary lapse in his armor. "I find it curious," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave, "that the garden seems to breathe in tandem with the house. When I stand in the foyer, I can feel the ivy pulling at the masonry. It is as if the estate is a single, respiration-driven organism." Amara moved closer, her voice taking on the low, melodic quality of a secret. "Because it is. The root and the stone are in a constant negotiation. The house provides the skeleton, the trellis, the anchor. The garden provides the skin and the breath. If you try to strip the vines away entirely, you will find the stone beneath has forgotten how to hold itself up. They have spent 20 years learning how to lean on one another. You cannot simply decide that the architecture is the only thing that matters." Elias remained silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window, where the overgrown hedge maze sprawled like a green labyrinth. For a second, the rigid architect seemed to vanish, leaving behind a man who looked profoundly tired. "I have spent my life believing that the only way to save a thing is to make it perfect," he said. "But this house, it defies perfection." "Perfection is a dead thing, Mr. Thorne," Amara replied softly. "Only growth is alive. Their intimacy was brittle, a thin glass bridge spanning a wide chasm, and it was shattered by a movement outside. Amara's gaze shifted toward the window. There, partially obscured by the dense, unpruned foliage of the hedge maze, stood Zoya Volkov. She was a pale smudge against the deep greens, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders as if the air itself were an insult. She wasn't merely strolling, she was stationed. In her hand she held a small leather-bound notebook, and her eyes were fixed on the study window with a clinical, predatory intensity. Every minute Elias spent in the company of the gardener was being catalogued, timed, and recorded. Amara felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room. Zoya was not a neighborly presence, she was a sentinel. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Zoya was the eyes and ears of Lady Beatrice. The estate had ceased to be a sanctuary and had become a panopticon. Every shared look, every lowered voice, and every breach of social decorum was being transcribed into a dossier that would undoubtedly find its way to the Sterling household by nightfall. "Who is that?" Elias asked, noticing the shift in Amara's posture. "A ghost of the village," Amara replied, her voice tightening. "One that prefers to watch from the shadows rather than walk in the light." Elias frowned, but the distraction was fleeting. He turned back to the table, his finger tracing a line on a map of the estate's original grounds. "These maps are useless," he admitted. "A stunning concession. They show the gardens as they were in 1810. They don't account for the migration of the soil or the way the creek has shifted the foundation of the east wing. Your knowledge of the current terrain, it is more accurate than any parchment I possess." Amara felt a surge of cautious triumph. "The land changes, Mr. Thorne. If you trust the map more than the mud, you will spend your life walking in circles." They stood there for a few minutes longer, speaking in low, hurried tones about the historical flora of the valley, the ancient oaks that predated the house and the rare ferns that clung to the dampest corners of the cellar. For a brief window of time, the social hierarchy and the looming threat of the equinox vanished. There was only the shared fascination of two people trying to decipher the same riddle from opposite sides of the board. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the study, Amara made her way back toward the garden gate to gather her tools. The light was a bruised purple, the kind of twilight that made the ruins of Willowmere look like a sleeping beast. As she reached the gate, she stopped. Nailed to the weathered wood of the post was a small, cream-colored slip of paper. There was no signature, but the handwriting was a sharp, sloping script that left no room for ambiguity. "The soil of Willowmere is rich, Miss Okoro, but it is a poor place to bury a reputation. Be mindful that improper associations often carry a cost that no amount of gardening can erase." Amara stared at the note, the paper fluttering in the evening breeze. She looked back at the house where a single lamp had been lit in the study. Elias was still there, perhaps still staring at the flowers, unaware that the walls of his sanctuary were already being dismantled, one observation at a time. Chapter 5. Chapter title, The Wabi Sabi Break. The smell of cedar shavings and linseed oil usually acted as a sedative for Elias, but today the workshop felt like a pressure cooker. He stood with his boots planted in the sawdust, his finger tracing a jagged fissure in the primary support beam of the east wing's vestibule. The crack was a violent zigzag, a betrayal of the grain. "It is untenable," Elias said, his voice clipped. "The structural integrity is compromised. I want the beam replaced with a fresh piece of seasoned oak, flush, seamless, and perfectly squared. A new beam is the only logical solution." Hiroshi Tanaka remained leaned against the workbench, watching Elias with a gaze that was unnervingly still. He rotated a small piece of sandpaper in his hand. The workshop was silent save for the ticking of a clock and the muffled cry of a moorhen in the marshes. "And what of the history of this wood?" Hiroshi asked. "This beam has held the weight of this house through a century of storms. It has bent, it has groaned, and it has survived. To replace it is to tell the house that its survival is a mistake." Elias adjusted his cufflink, the silver cold against his wrist. "Survival is not the goal, Mr. Tanaka. Restoration is. A crack is not a story, it is a failure of material." "Is a scar a failure of the skin?" Hiroshi stepped forward. "Does a soldier become less of a man because he carries the mark of a blade? The scar is the evidence of the victory." Elias felt a surge of irritation. He was a man of blueprints and immutable laws. The notion that a flaw could be an asset was offensive. He pointed a rigid finger at the fissure. "This is a structural liability." If I allow a single imperfection to remain in the foundation, the entire project is a lie." Hiroshi sighed and produced a small ceramic pot containing a shimmering resin mixed with powdered gold. "Kintsugi," the carpenter said softly, "we do not hide the break, we illuminate it. We fill the void with gold, making the object more precious because it was broken." "I will not have my house look like a piece of patched pottery," Elias snapped. "You will," Hiroshi replied, his tone absolute, "because I will not cut a new beam. I am a craftsman, Mr. Thorne, not a factory. If you wish for a seamless, soulless box, hire a builder from the city. If you wish to save Willowmere, you will learn to love the break." Elias stared at the gold resin. The loss of control felt like a physical weight. He studied the crack again, and suddenly, the fissure looked like a fault line in his own life. He remembered the great conservatory in London, the breathtaking scale of glass and iron. He remembered the moment the central spine had buckled under a freak snow load. It had been dismissed as an act of God, but he knew it was a result of his own rigidity. He had refused to allow for the organic shift of the earth. The collapse had erased his name from the architectural registers of the city. His breathing shifted into short, jagged gasps. The walls seemed to lean inward, the scent of cedar becoming stifling. Elias stepped back, his heel catching on a pile of shavings, and he slid down the brick wall. He hit the floor with a dull thud, hands clutching his throat, vision narrowing to a pinprick of light. He didn't hear her enter. He only felt the cooling presence of Amara as she knelt beside him. She didn't offer a platitude. She simply existed there, a grounding force smelling of damp earth and crushed mint, a scent that belonged to a world that didn't care about right angles. Elias leaned his head back against the brick, his chest still heaving. "I cannot allow it to be broken," he whispered, his voice stripped of its precision. "If there is a flaw, it means I have failed." Again. Amara looked at the beam, then back to him. "The land is broken, Mr. Thorne. The creek has moved. The oaks have leaned. Why is that the only kind of honesty you find unacceptable?" Elias let out a ragged laugh that sounded like a sob. The words spilled out, raw, as if the gold resin had finally filled a crack in his resolve. "The conservatory?" he began. "I spent 3 years calculating stress loads to the 4th decimal. I ignored the warnings about the clay soil because I believed that if I were precise enough, I could override the instability of the earth. When the spine snapped, it broke the trust of every patron in the city. I became a ghost before I ever left London." He waited for the pity. Instead, Amara's gaze drifted to the ruins of the estate visible through the open door. "My father was a botanist," she said quietly. "He was cast out of the academy for refusing to falsify his data to suit the crown's narrative. He died, knowing that the truth was a very lonely place to live. We are both ghosts, Elias. Some of us just have better blueprints for our hauntings." The distance between them vanished. There was no architect and no gardener. There were only two people standing amidst the wreckage of their own expectations. Elias studied his hands that had spent a decade trying to draw a perfect line, and realized they were shaking. He didn't try to hide it. The intimacy was a fragile thing, a thin thread of gold spanning a wide chasm. Elias began to reach out, perhaps to touch her hand or simply to anchor himself, when a violent, metal-sharp crash echoed from the direction of the archives. It was the sound of a heavy door being forced from its hinges, followed by the unmistakable slide of parchment being swept off a table. Both of them froze. The archives were restricted, and Elias held the only key. The intrusion was a violation. As they rushed toward the sound, the silence of the afternoon was replaced by the realization that while they had been learning to live with their breaks, someone had come to ensure the house finally collapsed. Chapter 6. The air in the village archives tasted of wet limestone and the slow, acidic decay of leather bindings. Amara leaned over the mahogany table, her fingers hovering just millimeters above a map of the valley that looked as though it had been drawn by a hand shaking with fever. Beside her, Arjun Mehta was a blur of motion, his glasses sliding perpetually down the bridge of his nose as he flipped through a stack of deeds with a speed that bordered on the violent. The only light came from a single, guttering oil lamp that cast long, skeletal shadows across the rows of shelving, making the thousands of dormant records feel like a crowd of silent witnesses. "It is a mathematical impossibility, Amara, a genuine, exhilarating impossibility." Arjun's voice arrived in a rapid-fire staccato, the words tripping over one another in his haste. He pointed a thin, ink-stained finger at a survey from 1812. Look here. The eastern boundary of Willowmere is marked by the old creek bed, yet the physical footprint of the ruins, the actual masonry Elias is currently scrubbing, extends 12 feet beyond this line. 12 feet. In the world of land tenure, 12 feet is a kingdom. It is a fortress. It is a scandal. Amara didn't answer immediately. She traced the line of the creek on the map, her mind shifting from the ink to the actual soil of the estate. She could almost feel the damp moss of the eastern wall, the way the ivy clung to the stone like a desperate lover. Why would the deeds be smaller than the house, she asked, her voice low, melodic, yet carrying a new edge of sharpness. One does not simply forget to record a wing of a manor. Precisely. Arjun beamed, his enthusiasm momentarily overriding his social clumsiness. He reached for a heavy vellum blueprint, its edges curled and yellowed like an old tooth. Because it wasn't a wing, it was a secret. Look at the layering here. He tilted the vellum toward the lamp. Under the dim light, the thickness of the parchment revealed a discrepancy. There was a faint, ghosted indentation beneath the primary ink, a second set of lines drawn with a lighter hand, perhaps in a different ink that had faded over a century. Amara leaned in, her breath hitching. She focused on the intersection of the library and the east gallery. There, hidden behind a false wall of architectural notation, lay a small rectangular void, a room without a door on the official plan. A ghost room. Clandestine meetings, Arjun whispered, his tone shifting to one of academic reverence. The Regency era was a theater of propriety, but the backstage was far more interesting. This room was designed for the things one could not say in the drawing room. Lovers, political dissidents, perhaps a disgraced relative. It is a pocket of silence built into the very bone of the house. Amara felt a sudden, electric jolt of clarity. For weeks she had played the role of the gardener, the quiet steward of the wild, reacting to the threats Lady Beatrice Sterling hurled at Elias. She had been a shield, passive and enduring, but as she stared at that hidden rectangle, the passivity vanished. This wasn't just a curiosity of history, it was a legal weapon. If the estate was larger than the deeds claimed, the entire basis of Beatrice's uninhabitable loophole was skewed. The land survey was the foundation of the lien, and the foundation was a lie. He is working on that wall, Amara said, her voice now a steady, cold current. Elias is reinforcing the east gallery right now. He's hammering brackets into the very masonry that hides this room. Arjun's expression soured, the excitement replaced by a flicker of dread. He adjusted his glasses with a sharp flick of his finger, which makes the timing precarious. If the Sterlings have a copy of these original surveys, or if they've suspected the room's existence, they won't let him find it. They could claim the undocumented land as public domain, or worse, use the discrepancy to argue that the Thorne title is fraudulent. Once a room like this is uncovered, it becomes a race to see who can claim the deed to the air inside it. Amara didn't wait for him to finish. The realization that the house held a secret meant that the house was no longer just a ruin to be saved. It was a puzzle to be solved before someone else stole the pieces. She turned to leave, her skirt sweeping through the dust of the archives, her mind already mapping the distance from the library to the gallery. She could see it in her mind, the heavy oak paneling, the smell of damp lime, the hidden latch that had waited 100 years to be pressed. She stepped out of the archive building and into the cool gray air of the village, her pace hurried. But as she turned the corner toward the main road, she stopped dead. Standing before the heavy iron gates of the archives was the village magistrate, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from a particularly sour turnip. He was flanked by 2 constables. Beside them, the door to the archives was shut tight, and the heavy iron bolt had been slid into place. "The archives are closed by order of the magistrate, Miss Okoro," the man said, his voice thin and devoid of warmth. "A matter of municipal auditing. No one enters or leaves until the records have been verified." Amara's heart didn't hammer, it went cold, a heavy stone settling in her gut. She looked past the magistrate toward the distant silhouette of Willowmere on the hill. There, idling at the very edge of the estate's perimeter, was a polished black carriage. The lacquer gleamed like a raven's wing in the fading light. Even from this distance, she could see the silhouette of a woman sitting upright in the window, a fan likely tapping against a wrist in a slow, rhythmic cadence of victory. Lady Beatrice Sterling had not waited for the archives to open. She had simply closed them. Amara stood frozen on the cobblestones, the map in her mind suddenly feeling like a trap. She had found the ghost room, but she had found it too late. The predator was already in the garden, and Elias, obsessed with his straight lines and perfect brackets, was hammering away at the very wall that held the key to his salvation, unaware that he was sealing himself into a corner from which there was no architectural escape. Chapter 7. The champagne was lukewarm, and the conversation was worse. Elias stood on the manicured lawn of the Sterling estate, his spine a rigid line of architectural precision that felt, for the first time, like a structural flaw. He wore a coat of midnight wool that fit with mathematical exactitude, yet he felt as though he were wearing a costume for a play in which he had forgotten the lines. Around him, the ton moved in a synchronized ballet of silk and hypocrisy, their laughter ringing out in high, brittle notes that reminded him of glass under too much tension. "And tell us, Mr. Thorne," a banker named Holloway asked, leaning in with a smile that stayed cold, "is it true that you are attempting to revive Willowmere? A bold venture, certainly, though some might call it a sentimental folly. One does not usually build upon a foundation of ghosts." Elias adjusted his cufflink, the silver cold against his skin. "The foundation is sound, Mr. Holloway. The instability is merely superficial. With the correct bracing and a commitment to the original geometry, the house will be habitable by the equinox." "Habitable," Holloway repeated, the word tasting of amusement. "A quaint ambition. Most men of your standing would simply raze the ruin and start anew. It is far more efficient than scrubbing the damp musk from a century of failure." Before Elias could respond with a technical rebuttal regarding the integrity of the lime mortar, the crowd parted. Lady Beatrice Sterling approached, her presence heralded by the rhythmic, predatory tap of her fan against her wrist. She wore a gown of pale gold that shimmered like a warning. Her smile was a masterpiece of social theater, wide and entirely devoid of warmth. "My dear Elias," she exclaimed, her voice projecting to the furthest reaches of the terrace, "I was just telling the Countess of Salisbury about your bravery. Truly, it is a testament to the human spirit that you persist in fixing that hopeless ruin. To spend one's days amidst the rubble of a fallen house, it is almost romantic, in a tragic, ruined sort of way, like a man trying to teach a dead bird to sing." Elias felt the heat climb his neck. The guests chuckled, a soft collective sound that felt like 1,000 small needles. He wanted to tell her that the house was not a ruin, but a dormant organism, that the decay was merely a veil. Instead, he remained frozen, the rigid etiquette of the afternoon acting as a corset, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Nearby, Zoya Volkov fluttered like a pale moth, drifting from one group to another. She leaned toward a cluster of young debutantes, her voice a high, airy whisper that nevertheless carried. "It is a wonder he finds the strength," Zoya murmured, glancing toward Elias. "I hear he spends his hours in the dirt with the staff. Such a peculiar friendship, don't you think? One wonders if the isolation of Willowmere has affected his sensibilities. It is a very lonely place for a man of his temperament." Elias closed his eyes for a second. The air was thick with the scent of overly manicured roses and expensive powder, a cloying sweetness that felt suffocating. He looked across the lawn and saw her. Amara stood at the periphery, near the edge of the boxwood hedges. She was not dressed for a party. She wore a simple dress of deep forest green, her hair unbound and catching the light. She looked like a piece of the wild world that had accidentally wandered into a museum of waxworks. She didn't wave or smile, she simply watched him, her gaze steady and knowing. Suddenly, the geometry of the afternoon shifted. The banker was still speaking, something about interest rates and land yields, but the words became a distant hum. Elias felt a surge of sudden, violent repulsion. He watched the polished shoes, the forced smiles, and the strategic pauses of Lady Beatrice, and he realized that this social redemption he had spent years craving was a hollow prize. He was fighting to be accepted by people who viewed a house as a ledger and a soul as a social asset. The rigid lines of the ton were not a structure to be admired. They were a cage. Without a word of apology to Holloway, Elias turned and walked away. He didn't glide or drift, he marched, his boots cutting a straight path through the sea of silk. He ignored the confused glances and the sudden silence that trailed in his wake. He navigated the perimeter of the party, slipping past the champagne towers and the tiered cakes, until the noise of the crowd faded into the rustle of leaves. He found her in the shadows of the hedge maze, where the air smelled of damp earth and crushed mint. Amara was leaning against a pillar of ivy, her presence a cool shadow in the afternoon heat. As he approached, the tension that had held his shoulders high for 3 hours finally snapped. "You look miserable," she said, her voice low and melodic, a sharp contrast to the shrillness of the terrace. "I feel as though I am being audited by a committee of vultures," Elias replied, his voice clipped but lacking its usual edge. He stopped inches from her, the space between them electric and unstable. "They speak of the house as if it were a corpse. They speak of me as if I am the undertaker." Amara reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his coat. "And are you?" "No," he whispered. "I am the one trying to wake it up." He studied her, really looked at her, and saw the soil beneath her fingernails and the fierce protective light in her eyes. In that moment, the distance between the architect and the gardener vanished. Elias did not think of the equinox, or the lean, or the eyes of the society he had just abandoned. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of defiance and desperation. It was not a polite kiss. It was a collision. It was the sound of a wall collapsing and a garden blooming all at once. For Elias, it was a total surrender of control. He stopped trying to measure the moment and simply existed within it. The world narrowed to the scent of her skin and the warmth of her breath against his lips. In the silence of the greenery, the social order of the Regency world felt like a distant, irrelevant memory. He realized he no longer wanted the applause of the ballroom. He wanted the truth of the ruins. They pulled apart slowly, their foreheads resting against one another, breaths hitching in the quiet. The world felt rearranged, the colors of the leaves more vivid, the air lighter. Elias felt a sense of clarity that no blueprint had ever provided. Then, a movement caught the corner of his eye. Behind the limestone pillar of the maze's entrance, a sliver of white fabric was visible, a lace cuff, a glimpse of a pale shoulder. The fabric shifted, then vanished back into the shadows. Elias froze, his heart slowing to a heavy, rhythmic thud. He didn't need to see the face to know who it was. Zoya Volkov had not been fluttering among the guests. She had been hunting. And she had just found exactly what she needed to destroy him. Chapter 8. The courier did not knock, he hammered. The sound fractured the dawn, sending starlings screaming from the eaves of Willowmere. Elias was already awake, hunched over a drafting table in the morning gloom, the ink on his latest sketch still wet. The door swung open, and a man in soot-stained livery stepped into the foyer holding a wax-sealed envelope with the precision of a death warrant. Elias took the parchment, his fingers tracing the heavy seal of the High Court. As he read, the air seemed to thin. It was a surgical strike. Lady Beatrice Sterling had not waited for the equinox. Using a combination of the uninhabitable clause and sworn affidavits regarding structural instability, likely penned by Zoya Volkov, Beatrice had secured an immediate injunction. All restoration work was frozen. The estate was to be placed in probate pending a seizure hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. "This is a lie," Elias whispered. He had focused so intently on the mathematics of the walls that he had forgotten the mathematics of malice. Beatrice hadn't played a game of architecture, she had played a game of leverage, and he had handed her the fulcrum. Amara appeared in the doorway, her boots caked in river silt, a bundle of wild mint in her arms. She didn't need to see the document to know the house felt brittle. "The courier looked as though he were delivering a plague," she said. "Worse," Elias replied. "She's frozen the site. If I cannot produce the expanded deed, the original grant that exempts the ruins from the habitability clause, the court will grant her the seizure by noon tomorrow." The expanded deed. "You said it was locked in the ghost room." "It is," Elias said, already moving toward the east wing. "The archives in town are incomplete. That room is the only place where the legal soul of Willowmere still exists." They ran through the corridors, the house feeling less like a project and more like a labyrinth closing in. The east wing was a skeletal stretch of limestone and rotting oak. As they rounded the final corner, a subterranean groan echoed through the floorboards. They stopped dead. A cloud of white limestone dust drifted through the air like powdered bone. Where the door to the ghost room should have been, there was only a wall of jagged rubble. The heavy rains had finally won, the ceiling had succumbed, burying the entrance under a mountain of gray stone and splintered beams. Elias stepped forward, his hand touching the debris. He felt a hollow vacuum in his chest. The blueprints in his mind were useless. He had treated the house as a puzzle to be solved with a ruler and compass, ignoring the grinding appetite of the soil. "I can't get in," he whispered, sinking to his knees. He felt the absurdity of his obsession, the way he had chased a phantom of perfection while the foundation slid into the lake. "Get up, Elias," Amara said, kneeling beside him. Her touch was the only thing that felt solid. "The house isn't gone. Only the door is. It's a wall of stone, Amara. I can't move a mountain by tomorrow. Perhaps not alone, a voice interrupted. Arjun Mehta stood at the end of the hall in a tweed coat 2 sizes too large, clutching a leather bag of tools. He was breathing hard, as if he had run from the village library. I heard the courier's horse, Arjun panted. I suspected Beatrice would move. I've studied the subterranean drainage of the east wing. There is a ventilation shaft, a narrow, forgotten conduit that leads from the cellar directly beneath the ghost room's floorboards. It's tight and filthy, but it's a path. Elias looked from Arjun to the rubble. You would risk coming down here? Now? The history of this house is more important than my laundry, Arjun replied. We tunnel, or we let a woman who views beauty as a line item on a ledger steal this place. For the next 12 hours, the three became a machine of singular purpose. They descended into the damp smelling of saltpeter and musk. Arjun led with excavation tools, while Elias and Amara hauled out sludge and shifted stones in a feverish rhythm. As the hours bled into the deep night, exhaustion stripped away Elias's defenses. He watched Amara, her face smeared with grime, her resolve unwavering. She wasn't fighting for a title, she was fighting for the soul of the place. If we lose it, Elias said, leaning against the cold cellar wall, I can't go back to being the man who only knows how to build things that fall apart. Amara stopped digging. The dim lantern light cast long shadows across her features. You aren't that man anymore, Elias. That man wouldn't be lying in the mud for a house he doesn't even technically own yet. Elias reached out, brushing dirt from her cheek. I realized something today. I would rather lose every stone of Willowmere than lose the person who taught me how to see the ruins. Amara leaned her forehead against his, a silent pact made in the dark. The intimacy was sharp and desperate, underscored by the knowledge that their time was evaporating. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cellar grates, a new sound arrived. It was the low, guttural thrum of an engine, a mechanical growl that vibrated through the soil. The demolition crew had arrived early, spurred by Beatrice's eagerness to clear the eyesore before the hearing. They're here, Arjun gasped. He threw his weight into one final, desperate shove with the iron pry bar. There was a sickening crack, and Arjun's hand punched through the ceiling of the conduit, breaking into the void of the ghost room. He let out a triumphant shout, but it was cut short. Above them, there was a sudden, grinding roar of shifting masonry. A heavy slab of limestone, dislodged by the vibration of the engines outside, crashed down. Arjun screamed as the ceiling collapsed further, pinning his arm beneath a jagged piece of the house he had tried so hard to save. Chapter 9. The limestone slab had pinned Arjun's arm with the indifferent weight of a century. The air in the cellar was a caustic soup of pulverized mortar and ancient dust. Elias didn't think. He lunged, sliding through the sludge of the conduit and diving into the jagged maw of the ghost room. The space was a skeletal ribcage of beams and broken slate, shivering with every guttural roar of the machinery on the surface. Above him, the ceiling groaned, a deep, wooden ache. Get out, Elias. Amara's voice was a raw edge. She strained against the slab, her face a mask of grime. The vibration, the whole wing is shifting. Elias ignored her, scanning the void. There, wedged between a fallen joist and rotting velvet drapery, lay the vellum cylinder. He scrambled forward, the dust coating his throat like powdered glass. As his fingers tightened on the parchment, a sharp crack echoed through the chamber. Plaster rained down, blinding him. He pivoted, clutching the document to his chest, and threw himself backward just as a secondary support beam gave way with a sound like a gunshot. He tumbled back into the conduit, colliding with Amara and Arjun in a tangle of limbs and filth. In the sudden silence, they lay heaving. Elias looked at the deed, then at Arjun, whose face was ghostly pale, but whose eyes were wide with triumph. You have it, Arjun rasped. The expanded deed, the land, the boundaries, it's all there. Elias stood slowly, draped in a shroud of gray dust, his fine linen shirt ruined. He looked less like an architect and more like a man who had crawled out of his own grave. He reached out to Amara, anchoring himself to her presence. We have to go up, he said. Now. They emerged from the cellar hatch into a scene of calculated theater. The morning air smelled of damp earth and idling engines. A small assembly had gathered on the lawn, village elite, members of the ton, and magistrates in official robes. At the center stood Lady Beatrice Sterling, a vision of ivory silk and strategic cruelty, her fan tapping a predatory beat against her wrist. The grace period has expired, Beatrice declared, her voice carrying with theatrical clarity. She studied the magistrates. As the residence remains uninhabitable and the owner unable to produce a valid claim to the expanded acreage, I move for the immediate seizure of the land. It is a mercy to replace this eyesore with something of actual utility." Zoya Volkov stood behind her, a triumphant smile on her lips. She leaned toward a neighbor, her voice a high, airy whisper. "Quite a tragedy, though one hardly expects a man of such volatile reputation to manage in the state." Elias stepped forward. The sound of his boots on the gravel was a jarring intrusion. The crowd shifted, taking in the spectre in ruined clothes clutching yellowed parchment. Beatrice's fan stopped. "Elias, I had hoped you would have the decency to depart quietly. To appear before the magistrates in such a state is precisely what we expected." Elias stopped a few feet from her. He studied the deed, then the house, the broken windows and stubborn, beautiful decay. "This document," Elias began, his voice steady, "is the expanded deed. It proves the land is secure, and the lien you attempted to leverage is void. Willowmere remains mine." He didn't hand the paper over immediately. He turned to the crowd, the peers who had excised him the moment his blueprints had failed. For years he had chased the ghost of their approval. "For a long time," Elias said, his voice growing louder, "I believed a man's value was measured by the precision of his lines and the prestige of his associations. I spent my life building walls to keep the world out, and in doing so I built a prison for myself." He turned toward Amara, who stood at the edge of the group, her hands still stained with soil. "I no longer care for the standing I once held in your circles," Elias declared, locking eyes with Beatrice. "The prestige of my former career is a husk. I renounce it. I renounce the expectations of a class that values the appearance of a garden over the life of the soil." In a move that sent a shockwave through the ton, Elias took Amara's hand. He laced his fingers through hers, ignoring the audible gasp from Zoya and the rigid posture of the magistrates. "Willowmere is more than real estate," Elias said. "It is a living thing. If this house is to be saved, it requires a steward who understands growth, decay, and the patience of the earth. Amara Okoro is that steward. She is my equal in every regard that matters, and she shall be the primary authority on the restoration of these grounds." Beatrice's mask slipped to reveal a raw fury. "This is preposterous. You would throw away your name for a gardener? You are committing social suicide." "I find the view from the bottom quite refreshing, Lady Beatrice," Elias replied in a cool whisper. "Especially when I am the one holding the deed." He handed the vellum to the head magistrate. After a long minute of examination, the official looked up. "The documentation is authentic," the magistrate announced. "The claim is valid. The seizure is denied." Beatrice stood frozen, her power neutralized by Elias's total indifference to the weapons she wielded. He had simply stepped out of the cage. As the crowd dispersed, there was no celebration. A heavy, cold silence lingered. The elite drifted away in whispering clusters. They had won the land, but they had stepped outside the boundary of the world they knew. Amara squeezed his hand. She didn't smile. "You've made yourself a pariah," she whispered. Elias looked at the ruins, then back at her. "I've never felt more at home." But as they turned toward the house, Elias noticed a figure lingering by the gate. Zoya Volkov was not leaving. She watched them, eyes narrow, clutching a small, leather-bound notebook to her chest. The look on her face suggested that while the legal battle was over, the war for their reputation had only just begun. Chapter 10. The rhythmic thud of a mallet against a wooden peg echoed through the main hall, no longer the frantic sound of a man fighting a deadline, but the steady heartbeat of a house coming back to life. Elias stood in the center of the atrium, his boots coated in a fine layer of limestone dust that had become a permanent fixture of his wardrobe. He watched the way the light slanted through the restored clerestory windows, illuminating the air in thick golden shafts. Beside him, Amara was guiding a small army of volunteers, locals from the village who had once looked at Willowmere as a tomb, as they carefully moved potted ferns into the alcoves. The air smelled of damp earth, fresh cedar, and the sharp tang of the gold resin that now traced the fractures in the overhead beams. Elias reached up, his finger tracing the jagged line of a repair on the primary support. He did not try to smooth it over or hide the seam. Instead, he felt the slight ridge of the resin, the gold shimmering like a vein of ore in a mountain. It was the mark of Hiroshi's influence, the physical manifestation of wabi-sabi. He remembered the early days of his return, when he would have spent a week sanding that beam into an invisible perfection, erasing the history of its collapse. Now, the scar was the most honest thing in the room. It told the story of the break and the mend, a narrative of survival that no blueprint could ever dictate. "You are staring at the ceiling again," Amara said, her voice a low vibration that seemed to ground the cavernous space. She stepped toward him, her dress of practical linen that was stained with the honest green of crushed stems. She didn't tuck her hair behind her ear this time. She let it fall, a wild curtain that mirrored the state of the grounds outside. "Are you checking for structural failure, or are you actually seeing it?" Elias lowered his hand and slid it into his pocket, a gesture of ease that would have been unthinkable 6 months prior. He didn't reach for his cufflinks. "I am seeing the tension," he replied. "The way the weight is distributed across the imperfections. It is far more stable than the original design. The original design assumed the world was static. This design accepts that the house will move." Amara smiled, a slow, private thing. "Like the gardens. The boxwoods are no longer fighting the ivy. They have reached a sort of truce." She led him toward the great doors, which swung open to reveal the transition from stone to soil. The estate was no longer a battleground between the manicured and the feral. The architectural lines of the terraces remained, providing a skeletal grace, but the growth had been allowed to spill over the edges. Wisteria climbed the pillars in heavy, fragrant clusters, and the paths were paved with a mixture of crushed slate and moss, creating a soft, breathing carpet beneath their feet. It was a blend of intent and accident, a symphony where the conductor had finally decided to let the musicians improvise. Near the east wing, Arjun was meticulously arranging a series of leather-bound ledgers on a mahogany table. He looked up, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, and beamed with an intensity that bordered on the monic. "The ghost room is officially an archive," he announced, his words tripping over one another in his haste. "I've catalogued the original 18th century surveys, and I've found a series of letters from the first architect that suggest the lakefront foundations were always meant to be porous. He wanted the house to breathe with the water. He was a visionary, Elias. Absolutely mad, but a visionary." Elias looked at Arjun, the man who had risked everything to provide the blueprints that saved the estate, and felt a surge of genuine affection. The archive was no longer a secret hoard of papers. It was the memory of Willowmere, open to those who cared for the truth of the place. The ghost room had been stripped of its haunting silence and filled with the rustle of parchment and the scent of old ink. It was the intellectual anchor of the house, ensuring that the restoration was not merely a cosmetic exercise, but a conversation with the past. At the edge of the driveway, a small carriage waited. Hiroshi Tanaka stood beside it, his posture as straight and deliberate as a temple pillar. He carried very little, a small chest of tools and a single rolled scroll. He had not spoken much during the final weeks of the project, preferring to let the wood speak for itself. As Elias approached, the old craftsman tilted his head, surveying the house, then the gardens, and finally the man standing before him. "The joinery is tight," Hiroshi said softly, "but the spirit is loose. That is the correct balance." "I still find myself wanting to measure the distance between the columns," Elias admitted, a wry smile touching his lips. "The urge to quantify the beauty is a hard habit to break." Hiroshi nodded slowly, a rhythmic movement of approval. "The map is not the territory, Mr. Thorne. You have stopped drawing the map and started walking the land. That is the only restoration that matters." With a final sharp nod, Hiroshi entered the carriage. As it pulled away, Elias felt a strange sense of completion. The mentor had not left him with a set of rules, but with the permission to be imperfect. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the village to settle the final accounts with the local suppliers, Elias noticed a figure standing in the shadow of the bakery's awning. Zoya Volkov was there, but the fluttering energy she once possessed had vanished. She was dressed in a gown that had been fashionable 2 seasons ago, the lace fraying at the cuffs. She clutched her shawl tightly, her eyes darting toward the villagers who passed her by. They didn't whisper about Elias anymore. They didn't gossip about the scandal of the gardener. Instead, they looked through her. Zoya had bet everything on the fall of the Thorne legacy and the victory of Lady Beatrice. Now that the house stood as a testament to a new kind of nobility, one based on authenticity rather than bloodline, Zoya had become a relic of a dead regime. She was a ghost in a town that had decided to wake up. Elias didn't stop to speak to her. There was no triumph in his stride, only a quiet indifference. He had spent his life fearing the judgment of people like Zoya, believing that his value was a sum of his accolades and his adherence to a rigid social code. But as he turned back toward the estate, he realized that the cage had not just been opened, it had been dismantled and used for firewood. As the sun began to dip, casting long, violet shadows across the lawn. Elias and Amara found themselves at the hidden garden path, the place where their hostility had first begun to dissolve into something more electric. The path was narrow, flanked by wild foxgloves and the heavy scent of damp pine. They stopped at a small, clear patch of earth near the base of an ancient oak, where the soil was dark and rich. Amara reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small, weathered packet of seeds. "These are rare hybrids," she whispered. "They require a kind of instability to thrive. They won't grow in a curated bed. They need the wind and the unpredictability of the wild." Elias knelt beside her, the damp earth soaking into the knees of his trousers. He didn't mind. He reached out, his hand covering hers as they pressed the seeds into the loam together. The touch was no longer a spark of friction, but a steady warmth, a shared breath. "No blueprints for this," Elias murmured, his voice rough. "None at all," Amara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We will simply let it grow and see what it becomes." They stayed there in the deepening twilight, two broken things that had found a way to fit together, standing in a house that was finally whole because it had stopped trying to be perfect. Chapter 1. Kezia Thorne knelt upon the gravel path of her cottage garden, the rosemary stems yielding under her shears with a crisp snap that echoed the sea's distant rhythm. Salt thickened the air, carrying the faint brine of waves breaking beyond the dunes, while the low sun cast long shadows across the time borders. A sudden gust from the sea lifted the pages of her open book, sending them skittering toward the low boundary wall. She set the shears aside and rose, one hand still gripping the handle of her teacup as she followed the drifting paper. The cup's rim warmed her fingertips through the porcelain, a small steadiness amid the scattering leaves, and she wondered how long it had been since any object in her possession had felt so reliably her own. Her steps carried her closer to the hedge, boots crunching softly on the gravel. Through its thinning gaps the neighboring estate appeared, its ivy grown thick over the stone and its shutters drawn tight against the fading light. The structure stood larger than she had first supposed, its roofline broken by a single chimney that leaned slightly toward the sea, as though the building itself strained to hear the tide. Moss crept along the base of the wall, and the scent of damp earth rose with each breath she drew. She paused there, teacup steady, and let the quiet press against her thoughts. Solitude had drawn her to this cottage, yet the estate's neglected silhouette reminded her that boundaries, once crossed, rarely stayed intact. Beyond the wall a low voice muttered, deliberate and measured, as though weighing each word before release. She paused, her fingers tracing the teacup rim once, twice. The latch of a rusted gate resisted under unseen hands, metal grinding against metal in a sound that spoke of long disuse. Kezia's pulse slowed in the way it always did when she sensed another presence, careful, observant, unwilling to intrude until necessity demanded it. The voice belonged to a man, she judged, and carried the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to command yet choosing restraint. Earl Waleed Harrington stood with his shoulders angled away from the opening, one gloved hand working the mechanism. He did not look toward the cottage side. The gate gave a reluctant creak, wood straining against hinges swollen by years of sea air. Kezia watched the line of his coat, the way his posture held tension without release, and felt the familiar pull of curiosity she had long trained herself to ignore. "Good evening," Kezia called across the divide, her voice carrying the measured pauses that had served her well in former households. She kept her tone even, neither warm nor distant, a neutral bridge across the hedge. "The latch requires a lift before the turn. The salt air has warped the iron." Waleed Harrington did not turn fully. His head tilted only enough to acknowledge the words, the brim of his hat casting his profile into partial shadow. "Your observation is apt," he said, voice low. "I had not considered the angle of the hinge." The gate swung wider under his renewed pull, the metal protesting with a drawn-out groan that seemed to echo the weight of whatever errand had brought him here at dusk. Kezia remained on her side of the wall, the teacup still in hand. She watched the Earl's posture ease by a fraction, a subtle loosening of the shoulders that suggested her advice had landed. Gratitude surfaced in his next words, clipped yet sincere, as he thanked her for the instruction without further elaboration. "It functions now. You have my thanks." He spoke as though each syllable cost something, yet the sincerity beneath the brevity struck her as genuine rather than perfunctory. Evening light thinned across the garden. The lighthouse beam swept its first slow arc, catching the edge of a folded letter that had fallen near Waleed's boots. Kezia stooped for her recovered book and saw his silhouette framed against the estate wall, unmoving as the beam passed. She studied the rigid line of his back, the way his gloved fingers flexed once at his side before stilling again. The light carved sharp edges from the ivy and stone, then moved on, leaving him in deepening shadow. Inside her thoughts the moment stretched. Here was the solitude she had sought, already threaded by another's difficulty. She wondered whether the dropped letter concerned the estate's neglect or some newer trouble, and whether her greeting had been presumption or necessity. The rosemary scent still clung to her hands, sharp and green against the cooling air. The light returned on its circuit. Walid's outline now revealed a second figure slipping away through the trees behind him, the shape indistinct yet purposeful in its retreat. Kezia's breath caught, her fingers tightened on the book cover. The figure moved with the quiet efficiency of someone practiced at avoidance, shoulders hunched, steps light on the carpet of fallen leaves. She could not discern height or clothing, only the sense of deliberate withdrawal, as though the meeting at the gate had been timed to end precisely when the beam swept past. Questions crowded her mind. Who had waited in the trees, and why had the Earl remained still rather than acknowledge the departure? Her own past had taught her the cost of noticing too much, yet the scene refused to release its hold. She considered calling out again, but held the impulse. The Earl remained still, his attention fixed upon the letter at his feet. The beam moved on, restoring shadow to the garden path. Kesia's grip on the teacup loosened by degrees, though the warmth had already bled from the porcelain. She traced the familiar curve of the handle with her thumb, grounding herself in the small, ordinary object, while the larger questions lingered unanswered. Walid bent at last to retrieve the paper. He straightened without glancing toward her hedge, the letter disappearing into his coat pocket with a single economical motion. The second figure had vanished among the trees, leaving only the faint sound of retreating steps on dry leaves, barely audible, yet enough to confirm what the lighthouse had briefly shown. Kesia's thoughts circled the implications: an earl who met someone in secret at twilight, a dropped letter, a gate that yielded only after her intervention. None of it belonged to her, yet the boundary felt thinner than the hedge suggested. Kesia stepped back from the wall. The lighthouse beam swept once more, illuminating the empty space where the Earl had stood. She carried her book and cup toward the cottage door, the question of the unseen departure lingering behind her. The gravel shifted beneath her boots with each measured stride, and the rosemary released its scent again as she brushed past the border. Inside the cottage the fire would still be banked low, offering the uncomplicated quiet she had chosen, yet the evening's images refused to fade. The gate latch clicked shut. Walid's low voice did not rise again. Only the sea and the turning light remained to mark the boundary between their grounds, the beam sweeping onward as though it too had witnessed more than it would reveal. Chapter 2. Earl Walid Harrington tested the weight of the fallen gate with one shoulder angled outward, his boots planted on the gravel where the hinge had given way. The iron bars resisted his push, their rusted surface cold against the wool of his coat sleeve. A tray clinked behind him. Miss Clara Thorne crossed the short distance from her cottage path, the china cup steady despite the uneven ground. "The light favors this hour for refreshment," she said, her voice even after the measured pause that always preceded her remarks. "Would you join me here at the wall?" Walid Harrington straightened, the motion deliberate, his shoulders already turning a fraction farther from her line of sight. He regarded the offered tray without immediate reply. Steam rose from the teapot, carrying the faint scent of bergamot over the rosemary border she had brushed past moments earlier. The invitation hung between them, neither accepted nor refused until his gloved hand lifted one cup. "Your kindness exceeds the occasion," he answered at last, settling onto the low stones without orienting his body toward hers. Kezia Thorne placed the tray between them on the flat top of the wall. She took her own seat, the fabric of her walking dress settling with a soft rustle that matched the distant rush of the tide. Her index finger found the porcelain rim of her cup and traced its curve once. "Tradesmen will arrive by the main drive tomorrow," she observed. "A chair placed at the correct angle spares both parties the awkwardness of a prolonged stand." The Earl's reply came low, each word spaced with care. "Such seating spares the estate further comment as well." The tea cooled between their cups, while the lighthouse beam completed another slow pass overhead, its edge catching the steam before it dispersed. He did not elaborate on the ledgers still stacked in the library, their pages marked only by the dust that gathered when no steward attended them. Kezia Thorne kept her hand still on the cup once the rim grew warm beneath her touch. Further questions would cross the boundary. the hedge already marked too thinly. Instead, she lifted the pot and refilled his cup, the liquid sound steady against the evening air. The beam flickered as clouds thinned above the tower, then steadied again. Waleed Harrington mentioned the untended ledgers in the same low register, his attention fixed on the darkening lane beyond the wall. The admission carried no appeal for assistance, only the bare statement of a task deferred. Clara Thorne offered no immediate counsel, her fingers resting now on the tablecloth edge rather than the porcelain. A rider's approach sounded first as the rhythmic strike of hooves on packed earth. Waleed Harrington rose at once, the movement abrupt enough to shift the tray by a fraction. He did not reach for his cup again. The horse slowed at the boundary where the lane met the road, its rider's hat casting a shadow across his features before the figure turned the animal and continued without a word exchanged. The Earl remained standing, one hand still resting near the fallen gate. "Darius Harrington begins his market remarks at first light," he said. The words left the question of those remarks open between them, neither confirmed nor denied by the rider's silent passage. Clara Thorne gathered the tray, her steps measured as she returned along the path where the rosemary released its scent once more. Inside the cottage the fire required no tending yet, but the evening's exchange lingered in the arrangement of the remaining cups. She set the tray on the sideboard and traced the handle of the last cup once before moving to the window. The gate remained visible from this angle, its iron bars now upright but still unlatched. The second figure from the previous twilight had not reappeared, though the possibility that it might return under cover of the next dusk pressed against the quiet she had sought. Waleed Harrington walked the length of his own boundary wall before the rider's dust settled. The estate ledgers waited inside, their pages offering no counsel on the cousin whose visits always preceded fresh whispers among the neighboring landowners. He adjusted his coat once at the shoulder, the gesture habitual, then turned toward the house where no lamps had yet been lit in the public rooms. Clara Thorne extinguished the single candle on the table, leaving the room in the soft half-light that filtered from the lighthouse beam. The invitation to tea had altered nothing in the formal sense, yet the rider's pause at the boundary suggested that formalities alone would not contain the matter. She placed the book she had carried earlier beside the tray and did not open it again that night. The following morning brought no further sign of the rider, only the sound of a cart approaching the main drive as the tradesmen arrived at the appointed hour. Waleed Harrington met them at the gate, the chair positioned as Miss Thorne had advised, his shoulders still angled away from any observer on the cottage side. The exchange lasted no longer than necessary, yet the presence of an additional witness at the boundary would have altered its tone entirely. Miss Halima Voss passed along the lane later with a basket of herbs, nodding once in acknowledgement when Clara Thorne stepped outside. No words crossed the hedge, but the herbalist's direct glance carried the weight of shared understanding about the estate's visible neglect. The lighthouse beam continued its circuit, indifferent to the small adjustments of posture and speech that governed the ground between the two properties. Waleed Harrington returned the chair to its usual place inside the gate after the cart departed. The ledgers remained untouched for another hour while he considered the market remarks already in circulation. Darius Harrington's smooth delivery at such gatherings required no physical presence to achieve its effect, only the timing of a single rider's silent pause. Clara Thorne resumed her reading by the window, the page turned only after the Earl's figure had withdrawn from view. The question of the dropped letter from the previous evening stayed unvoiced, as did the identity of the retreating figure among the trees. Both remained beyond the hedge, where the boundary still held, though the latch had been repaired. Chapter 3. Clara Thorne reached for a bundle of rosemary at the edge of the herb stall, the vendor already wrapping the stems in coarse paper, when Halima Voss appeared at her elbow without ceremony. The market square held its usual press of baskets and aprons, the scent of fresh bread competing with the sharper tang of dried lavender from the next display. Sunlight filtered through the canvas awnings in dusty shafts, catching on the edges of metal tang coins and the weathered faces of villagers who paused too long between stalls. Kezia felt the weight of those glances even as she pretended otherwise. Halima's single sharp nod directed Kezia's attention toward the bread cart a few paces away, where the crowd thinned enough for private speech. They stepped aside together, Kezia adjusting the weight of her basket against one hip. Her fingers brushed the rough weave of the handle, grounding her as the hum of bartering voices swelled and receded around them. "The Earl's accounts show no improvement," Halima said, her voice low, and carrying the faint cadence of her mother's country. She kept her eyes on the loaves, never quite meeting Kezia's. Tenants speak of letters that should not have left the study. One wonders how an outsider's name appears on documents meant for family eyes alone. Kezia's pulse quickened beneath the steady rhythm of market sounds. The creak of cartwheels, the clink of scales, the distant bark of a dog tied near the inn. She shifted her stance slightly, angling her body to shield their conversation from the herbalist behind them. Darius Harrington's voice rose from the adjoining stall, smooth as ever and edged with practiced solicitude. "One cannot help but note how quickly new faces alter the tone of a quiet estate," he remarked to the fishmonger, the words pitched to Carrie without seeming deliberate. "Particularly when those faces once held positions of trust in town households. A lighthouse keeper, they say, with connections that stretch farther than the beam itself." Kezia turned her head only slightly. She caught the flicker of Darius's profile, his polished boots planted wide, one hand gesturing as though the topic were mere idle talk, before she answered. "How far do such observations travel before the weekends, Mr. Harrington?" she asked, her tone even and carrying the small reflective pause that often followed her questions. Inside, doubt coiled tighter. Did he know about the writer already? Or was this another test to see what she would reveal? Halima's soft accent continued once the cousin moved on, her words threading between the calls of vendors hawking onions and the shuffle of boots on packed earth. "The entailment document already circulates among the tenants. One copy reached the parson yesterday, another the miller by evening. They compare signatures and wonder which distant relative will next claim the coastal acres. The Earl's seal appears genuine, yet the timing suggests someone hurried the ink dry." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a loaf as though testing its warmth. Kezia noted the slight tension in Halima's shoulders, the way her gaze flicked toward the road twice in the space of a breath. Kezia's fingers found the rim of an imaginary cup and traced it once before she steadied the basket again. The motion steadied her breathing without drawing notice from passers-by. She kept her gaze on the loaves rather than the speaker, though the memory of steam rising from porcelain offered brief respite from the tightening in her chest. What did Halima truly risk by speaking so plainly? And how much of that risk had already transferred to her own name? The crowd shifted with the arrival of a cart loaded with early apples, their skins catching the light like polished coins. Halima's hand brushed hers briefly, the contact quick and deliberate. A folded note passed between them without comment. Kezia slipped it into her basket beneath the rosemary and moved toward the striped awning of the baker's stand, the paper's edge pressing against her palm like a second pulse. She could feel the weight of unseen watchers in the way conversations dipped as she passed. Under the canvas shade, she unfolded the paper just enough to read the brief lines. The script was Halima's own, careful and economical. The writer observed at dusk had returned twice more, each time carrying a sealed packet toward the Harrington boundary. No name was attached to the message, only the hour and direction. Kezia read it twice, committing the details to memory, while the herbalist behind the counter watched the road with practiced indifference. The scent of yeast and warm crusts filled the space, yet it did nothing to ease the unease settling in her stomach. Who carried those packets, and what did they contain that required such secrecy under cover of evening light? Halima remained at the edge of the awning, eyes on the road where carts turned toward the lanes. Her posture suggested she would not speak further unless addressed, though the slight tilt of her head invited the question Kezia held back. Mr. Leandro Quinn crossed the square from the direction of the inn, arms already folded across his chest at the sight of the two women together. He halted a respectful distance, yet made no move to continue past them, his boots planted firmly as though anchoring the moment and place. "Miss Thorne," he said, the words clipped, though the volume remained moderate. "I had not expected market day to draw you from the lighthouse so soon after your arrival." His gaze moved from her basket to Halima and back, a silent assessment that lingered a beat too long. Kezia inclined her head. "The garden requires what the stalls supply, Mr. Quinn. One cannot live on solitude alone." She adjusted the basket higher on her hip, the note now hidden, but its presence a steady reminder against her side. Quinn's stance eased a fraction, though the arms stayed crossed. "Solitude draws less comment than shared counsel with those whose affairs lie outside one's own household." "The tenants notice such meetings, Miss Thorne. They weigh every word exchanged beneath these awnings." Halima offered her single nod, this time directed at both of them, and stepped back into the flow of shoppers. The question of how many reputation points such guidance had already cost hung between the remaining two without further speech. Kezia returned the note to her basket and turned toward the road that led past the repaired gate, the weight of the paper heavier than the herbs it rested beside. Chapter 4. Chapter title, Gathering Gone Astray. Earl Waleed Harrington stood on the Harrington terrace and directed the footman to shift the last mahogany chair 2 inches leftward. The placement followed the diagram Miss Thorne had sketched on the boundary wall 3 days prior, its lines still clear in his mind. The sea wind tugged at the edges of the linen tablecloth, but did not disturb the row of teacups already set in even intervals. He watched the footman's hands adjust the final inch, then another fraction, until the alignment satisfied some private standard he could not name. The chairs faced the garden path in precise order, their backs catching the afternoon sun that slanted across the repaired stones. Waleed's fingers tightened briefly around the edge of the nearest table before he released it. He had not expected the wind to carry the faint tang of salt so sharply today, nor the way it lifted dust from the lane below and deposited it against the hem of his coat. The first carriage arrived while the servants were still straightening the final seat. Its wheels crunched over gravel that had been raked only that morning, the sound carrying farther than Waleed had anticipated. Lady Marston descended with her daughter, both in pale sprigged muslin that caught the afternoon light, and fluttered against their ankles as they approached the steps. Waleed greeted them at the steps, his shoulders angled slightly away as he offered the required civilities. He noted the way Lady Marston's gaze moved past him to the empty chairs and the untouched teapot, her expression remaining composed even as her daughter's hand tightened on her elbow. "Lady Marston, the garden has recovered enough to welcome visitors again," he said, voice low and measured. She inclined her head without comment on the estate's recent neglect, though her eyes lingered on the boundary wall where fresh mortar still showed pale against the older stone. The daughter offered a small curtsy that did not quite reach the ground before she stepped back, her muslin skirt brushing the terrace rail. Lord Darius Harrington arrived in the next group, his coat cut narrower than custom allowed for a country afternoon. The fabric pulled taut across his shoulders as he moved, and the buttons caught the light in a way that suggested recent polishing. He paused beside the matron whose name Waleed could never quite retain and leaned forward until their shoulders nearly touched. The words reached Quinn, who had entered last and already stood with arms folded across his chest, his boots planted firmly on the gravel as though he meant to remain there for the duration. Darius's voice carried just far enough, a low murmur that shaped the phrase, "proper distances," with deliberate care before he straightened again. Waleed turned to each arrival in turn, offering the silver tray of cups and the small plates of biscuits that had been baked that morning. When the same matron refused a second cup of tea, his deliberate greeting faltered for half a breath. He watched her fingers lift from the cup's handle without lifting it, her mouth forming a polite refusal that left the pot suspended in his hand. He set the silver pot down without remark, and instead offered the view of the repaired boundary wall, describing the work in measured phrases that did not invite further questions. The matron's nod came after a silence, and her departure followed shortly after, the carriage door closing with a soft click that echoed against the terrace stones. Quinn's arms tightened further across his coat, the fabric of his sleeves creasing under the pressure. The phrase I heard was improper proximity at the boundary wall, spoken with the sort of concern that travels faster than any carriage, he said, the words clipped. No one answered him directly. Instead, the remaining guests shifted their weight, skirts rustling and boots scraping lightly against the stone as eyes turned toward the lane. Quinn's jaw worked once, the muscle shifting beneath his skin, before he exhaled through his nose and adjusted his stance again. From her position behind the low stone wall that marked the edge of the Harrington grounds, Miss Kezia Thorne watched the small assembly. The wall's surface felt cool beneath her palm, even through the thin gloves she wore, and the herbs in her basket released a faint green scent each time the wind shifted. 2 carriages had already turned away before the tea things were cleared. Their wheels left fresh ruts in the lane dust, the tracks crossing over older impressions from earlier visits. She kept her fingers still on the folded note inside her basket, though the paper's edge pressed against her palm with each breath she took. The note contained only the hour and a direction, yet its presence now weighed more than the herbs beside it. She wondered whether the Earl had noticed her watching, or whether the afternoon silence would simply add another line to the gossip already circling the estate. Waleed did not attempt defense of the afternoon's purpose. Instead, he made one low request that the remaining guests join him for a brief tour of the ledgers in the library. The offer met only the sound of skirts rustling toward the waiting vehicles, the fabric whispering against itself as the women moved, their faces turned slightly aside. One guest murmured something about an appointment already scheduled, the words trailing off before they reached completion. The final carriage departed before any guest had moved toward the house, its wheels turning slowly at first, then gaining speed as the driver urged the horses onward. Darius's figure remained visible longest, his retreating back straight, as he raised a hand in what might have been farewell or dismissal. The question of whether the Earl's title could survive the first lost invitations lingered in the empty space between the terrace and the gate, pressing against the quiet that settled once the dust had begun to settle. Quinn lingered at the gate after the others had gone, his stance rigid once more. He offered no further phrase before turning toward his own modest holdings, the set of his shoulders unchanging as he walked away. The gate latch clicked behind him with finality, the sound carrying across the now empty terrace. Inside the house the terrace door stood open. Walid remained on the stone, the wind now carrying the faint scent of yeast from the village bakery across the boundary. He thought of the sealed packets Halima had mentioned at the market, and of the rider whose paws had drawn every eye. Neither matter could be addressed while invitations still cooled on the table. The thought circled once, then twice, before he turned his attention to the chairs left in their precise rows. Kessia stepped back from the wall. The note in her basket contained only the hour and a direction, yet its presence now weighed more than the herbs beside it. She wondered whether the Earl had noticed her watching, or whether the afternoon silence would simply add another line to the gossip already circling the estate. The sun lowered toward the lighthouse roof. No further carriages approached, and the chairs remained exactly where the footman had placed them according to her earlier sketch. The linen tablecloth lifted once more in the wind, then settled, the teacups still untouched in their even intervals. Chapter 5. Miss Kessia Thorne traced the edge of the letter from Miss Halima Voss with one fingertip, while the gravel path crunched beneath her half-boots. The words inside spoke of caution and an offer of further correspondence, yet the paper trembled slightly in the salt breeze that lifted the hem of her walking dress. She had chosen the estate boundary path precisely because no carriage could follow its uneven line without drawing notice. Morning light filtered through the low branches overhead, casting shifting patterns across the page, and each step released the faint bitterness of crushed leaves underfoot. Her breath came evenly, but her thoughts circled the same narrow question: how much longer could these private exchanges remain private when every hedgerow seemed to listen? Footsteps approached from the side lane without announcement. Earl Walid Harrington fell into step beside her, his shoulders angled away from her direction even as his stride matched hers exactly. The fabric of his coat brushed the low hedge once, then no more. Kezia did not turn her head at once. She felt the air between them tighten, as though the path itself had narrowed in response. He carried no cane today, only his gloved hands clasped behind his back, and the absence of that small prop left his posture oddly exposed. "The ledgers remain unexamined," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Yet the absence of further invitations suggests the matter may soon be decided without them." Kezia kept her gaze on the folded sheet in her hand. "Solitude was the reason I took the cottage," she answered after a measured pause. "Now even the lighthouse beam seems to announce every step beyond its walls." She felt the weight of his attention settle on the letter without ever quite touching it. A small muscle moved at the corner of his mouth, quickly stilled. He walked on for several paces before replying, his boots striking the gravel in measured rhythm with hers. "Your caution does you credit," he said at last. "I find myself measuring every word I commit to paper these days, as though each one might be read aloud before the assembly." She heard the effort it cost him to keep his tone even. The path curved slightly, and for a moment their sleeves nearly brushed. He checked his step at once, angling farther outward so that a thin strip of air remained between them. Kezia's fingers tightened on the letter's edge. She wondered how much of his restraint stemmed from fear of observers, and how much from the simple habit of guarding what remained of his name. They continued in silence for several paces. The path narrowed where the cliff began its rise, forcing them closer until the wind carried the faint scent of yeast from the distant bakery. Walid adjusted his hat once, a small motion that revealed the tension in his jaw. The low hedge gave way to open grass on their right, and the sea's steady murmur rose to meet them, threaded with the sharper cry of gulls wheeling above the rocks. "My cousin's documents circulate with precision," he continued. "One signature could transfer the coastal holdings before the assembly meets. I had hoped quiet management might forestall the claim." Kessia studied the horizon for a moment before answering. "And I had hoped the garden walls would shield me from the need to weigh every word spoken in company," she replied. Her fingers returned to the paper's edge, smoothing a crease that had not been there before. She sensed, rather than saw, the way his shoulders tightened at the admission. It was the smallest shift, yet it spoke of shared ground neither of them wished to name aloud. The lighthouse beam swept across the path ahead, a pale arc that briefly illuminated the rough stones at their feet before moving on. They reached the cliff edge together. Kessia stopped first. The wind tugged at the loose strands of hair beneath her bonnet, carrying the salt tang more sharply now, and she felt the sudden exposure of standing so high above the water. Below, waves broke against the rocks in irregular rhythms, their sound rising and falling like uncertain breath. "Further letters might yet steady the ground beneath both our positions," she said. I will write to Miss Voss this evening and ask what arrangements remain possible before the assembly." She let her thumb rest against the folded edge of the letter, tracing the slight ridge where Halima's seal had once pressed. Walid did not answer at once. He remained half-turned from her, gaze fixed on the shifting water, yet she could feel the consideration passing through him, heavy and deliberate. Beyond the trees, a curtain in the nearest cottage window shifted, the movement brief yet unmistakable. Neither spoke of it. Walid turned back toward the house path, shoulders still angled, while Kessia remained a moment longer with the letter pressed between her palms. The fabric of his coat caught the light once as he moved away, then vanished among the hedgerows. The following morning, a second sheet arrived from Miss Halima Voss, delivered by a village boy who waited only for confirmation of receipt before departing. Kezia stood at her garden gate, the scent of salt heavy in the morning air, and unfolded the brief lines. The walk had been noted by at least 2 observers, the note stated, and questions already formed concerning the absence of a chaperone. She read the words twice, letting the paper tremble slightly in her grasp. The boy's footsteps had already faded down the lane, leaving only the gate's faint creak and the distant slap of water against stone. Inside the cottage, the kettle sang on the hearth, yet she did not move toward it. She read the words twice, then carried the paper inside to the small writing table near the window. Sunlight slanted across the oak surface, catching on the inkwell's brass rim. The pen moved steadily across fresh paper as she formed her reply, asking whether affection itself could still be weighed against the coming assembly without immediate ruin to either reputation. Each sentence required deliberate care. She paused between them to listen to the garden beyond the open casement, where bees moved among the late roses, and the air carried the faint metal-sharp edge of the tide. The question remained unanswered on the page when she folded the sheet and reached for the sealing wax. What assembly could possibly restore what one unchaperoned path has already placed at hazard? She asked aloud as the wax cooled beneath her fingers. The garden gate stood ajar behind her, and through it the path stretched empty, waiting. Chapter 6. Chapter title, Herbalist Networks. Miss Halima Voss lifted the latch on the weathered gate of the first cottage and stepped onto the packed earth path, her bundle of dried lavender and rosemary tied with plain twine resting against her forearm. Salt from the nearby tide clung to the air, sharpening the scent of the herbs into something brisk and medicinal. A folded slip of paper, its edge barely visible, lay tucked between the stems. She adjusted the bundle once, the motion small enough to pass for habit, and felt the weight of the hidden message settle against her wrist. The tenant's wife opened the door at once and accepted the herbs with a quiet word of thanks, her eyes lingering on the note before she slipped it into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed the twine a second longer than necessary, and Halima caught the faint tightening at the corner of the woman's mouth. An acknowledgment, nothing more. Halima offered no further remark and moved on along the narrow lane that wound between the low stone walls, the sound of her steps softened by the damp earth. The same afternoon brought 2 wagons of grain to the tenant holdings farther along the shore road. Earl Walid Harrington stood at the edge of the yard, shoulders angled away from the gathering, and watched the sacks carried into the storehouse. Dust from the grain rose in thin clouds, catching the low sunlight and turning the air hazy between the buildings. He spoke only to confirm the measure for each household, his low voice carrying no farther than the man beside him. The tenants accepted the delivery without ceremony, though several glanced toward the Earl before returning to their work. One man hesitated, his hand resting on a sack as if testing its weight against some private calculation. Walid noted the pause, but made no move to intervene, letting the moment pass into the steady rhythm of unloading. By evening, the small assembly hall near the harbor had filled with local families and a scattering of visiting gentry. The scent of damp wool and lamp oil hung thick beneath the rafters. Lord Darius Harrington entered with measured steps, his coat freshly brushed, and his expression arranged in lines of mild interest. He paused near the refreshment table and addressed the first group of women already seated there. "One hears the most curious reports of late walks along the cliff paths," he said, the words smooth and edged with concern. "Particularly when a retired governess is said to meet a titled visitor without proper attendance." His gaze flicked briefly toward the window as he spoke, then returned to the women with the same polite curve at his mouth. The women exchanged glances but offered no immediate reply, their teacups shifting in gloved hands. Halima entered a moment later and took a place near the window, her posture straight. She listened without comment until Darius leaned closer to repeat a second detail about documents left carelessly on a writing table. Then she gave a single sharp nod toward the door. The 3 women rose together, murmured excuses about waiting carriages, and left the circle without looking back. One paused at the threshold to smooth her skirt, the motion deliberate, before stepping into the corridor. Darius watched their departure with no change in his expression, though the fingers of his left hand tapped once against the table edge before stilling. Earl Walid remained at the edge of the room, hands clasped behind his back. As each ally approached to report the grain had reached its destination, he thanked them by name in the same deliberate tone. "Mrs. Reed, your assistance with the storehouse records has been precise," he said to one. "Mr. Brunn, Ellis, the ledgers you reviewed yesterday require only your final signature." His thanks drew no attention from the larger company, yet each recipient straightened slightly before moving away. Walid tracked the departures from the corner of his eye, noting the slight lift in their shoulders that suggested the words had landed as intended. A boy in a plain coat brought Kezia's note to the hall and placed it in Halima's hand during a brief pause near the side door. The message, written in measured lines on plain paper, warned that Mr. Leandro Quinn had already heard the latest whisper concerning the unchaperoned path. Kezia's fingers had left a faint trace of ink at the edge where the pen had rested too long. Halima read the note once, folded it, and returned to the main room without altering her expression, though the faint pressure of her thumb against the paper betrayed the second reading she gave it in her mind. Through the course of the next hour, Halima's quiet exchanges secured 2 additional invitations for the Earl to review estate matters with neighboring families. She spoke directly, yet kept her voice low enough that only the intended listener caught each word. The agreements were given with brief handshakes rather than formal declarations, and the recipients departed before Darius could approach them again. One man lingered a moment longer, his eyes meeting hers in silent confirmation before he turned toward the door. Lord Darius watched from the far side of the hall as the final target, a widow whose late husband had held a minor interest in the entailment papers, accepted Halima's suggestion and stepped through the outer door. His smile remained unchanged, the corners of his mouth lifted in the same polite curve he had worn upon entering. He turned to the remaining company and offered a remark about the local tea, his voice carrying no trace of the setback. The assembly thinned as the hour grew late. Earl Walid collected his hat from the attendant and paused once at the threshold. The empty hall still held the scent of the grain dust that had clung to the wagons earlier, mixed now with the faint trace of rosemary from Halima's bundles. He did not speak of the note or the invitations aloud. Beyond the harbor the lighthouse beam swept across the water at regular intervals. Miss Clara Thorne sat at her writing table with the garden gate still ajar, the sealing wax from her earlier letter cooled, but the question of the assembly unanswered. She traced the rim of her teacup once, then set it aside. Mr. Leandro Quinn stood outside the hall and crossed his arms while he waited for his carriage. He had heard the whisper, as the note stated, yet he had not repeated it inside. The question remained whether his silence would hold through the following day. Halima walked the lane back toward her own cottage, the remaining bundles lighter now. She nodded once to a passing tenant who had received both grain and a private word of support. The night air carried the metal edge of the tide. In the empty assembly hall the last candle guttered. The question of how long estate gains could outpace the next inheritance threat lingered among the unused chairs, unanswered by any voice present. Chapter 7. Miss Clara Thorne turned the heavy paper once more upon her cottage table, the ball invitation lying open beside her cooled teacup. The seal bore the crest of a London house, whose name she had not spoken aloud in months, and the date pressed against her thumb as she aligned it with the ledger of estate notes that still required her quiet counsel. Lantern light caught the edge of a silk ribbon she had set aside for the journey, its color too bright against the faded wood. The flame guttered softly with each breath of wind through the half-open window, casting elongated shadows across the stacked papers. Outside, the tide whispered against the shingle, a steady rhythm that usually steadied her thoughts, yet tonight it only sharpened the unease coiled beneath her ribs. She reached for the quill to mark the hour of departure, then paused when the garden gate clicked without the usual knock. Mr. Leandro Quinn stepped through the frame, his coat dusted from the lane, yet his cravat untouched. He did not wait for permission before crossing to the table, his gaze fixed on the open card. "This association continues at peril to every name attached," he said, the words clipped and even. "Your name appears on the list beside Harrington's. Mine will not follow." Kessia set the quill down without lifting her eyes from the paper. She measured the silence between his sentence and her reply, tracing the cup rim with one fingertip until the porcelain warmed beneath it. The motion steadied her pulse even as doubt flickered through her mind. What did Quinn truly fear beyond the entailment? "Connection need not equal ruin when conducted with care," she answered at last. The pause after each phrase held the weight of the answer she withheld. She wondered whether her words sounded as hollow to him as they felt to her. Quinn's arms stayed folded across his chest, the stance unchanged from the moment he entered. He shifted his weight once, boots scraping the flagstone, yet the barrier of his posture did not ease. "Care has already drawn notice," he said. "Darius carries the tale to every neighbor whose favor might sway the entailment." His voice carried no rise, only the finality of a man who had weighed the cost to his own holdings. His jaw tightened briefly before settling back into its rigid line, and Kessia caught the flicker of something more, perhaps regret or simple exhaustion, behind his steady stare. The door latch lifted again before Kezia could form the next measured response. Miss Halima Voss stood at the threshold, 2 bundles of dried herbs tucked beneath one arm. She offered a single sharp nod toward the table, the gesture sufficient to signal that the London season list had already been altered in the village record. No further word passed between them. Halima set the bundles beside the door and withdrew into the lane. Kezia noted the slight hesitation in her friend's step, a silent acknowledgment of shared risk that lingered after the latch clicked shut once more. Kezia's fingers returned to the cup brim, the motion slower now. She broke the invitation's remaining seal under her thumb, the wax yielding with a faint crack that echoed against the cottage walls. The scent of rosemary from Halima's bundles mingled with the salt air that entered through the open door, threading through the room like an uninvited witness. Quinn watched the motion without unfolding his arms, his eyes tracking the fragments as they scattered across the wood grain. A rider approached along the garden path before either spoke again. The sealed letter he delivered bore Earl Waleed Harrington's hand, delivered the same hour as Quinn's arrival. Kezia read the brief lines at the table. The Earl asked whether she would attend, despite the risk to both names, and whether the estate ledgers could wait until after the assembly. She placed the letter beside the broken invitation, her thoughts turning over the Earl's careful phrasing. Did he sense the same tightening net? Or was this merely another test of her resolve? "My holdings cannot absorb further whispers," Quinn said from the doorway, his final warning delivered without turning back. "The entailment papers already list every connection that might be questioned." He stepped into the lane, arms still crossed, and the gate closed behind him with the same click that had announced his entrance. The sound reverberated longer than it should have, settling into the quiet spaces between her breaths. Kessia remained at the table, the invitation and the Earl's letter now side by side. The lantern flame wavered once as the night breeze moved through the open door. She did not reach for the ribbon again. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, the earlier tracing of the cup rim leaving a faint warmth on her fingertip. The question of whether reputation still served as armor for either of them settled across the empty surface, unanswered by the remaining papers or the distant sound of the tide. Outside the cottage, the harbor light swept its beam across the water at regular intervals, catching the edge of a carriage that waited beyond the lane. Quinn's silhouette crossed before it, the arms still folded, before the vehicle carried him toward his own modest property. Kessia rose only to secure the door, yet the seal fragments remained on the table where she had left them. The invitation's date seemed to press against the wood even after she extinguished the lantern. She returned to her chair in the dark, the Earl's letter still open beside the cup. The words asked for her presence at the ball, but the cost of that presence lingered in the silence Quinn had left. Reputation had once shielded her from city scrutiny. Here, beside the sea, it threatened to close doors that quiet kindness had begun to open. She traced the rim once more, though the porcelain held no warmth now, and considered how many names might yet be struck from lists because of a single association. Halima's bundles gave off their steady scent, a reminder of the alliances secured at the assembly without public declaration. The altered season list meant one fewer name would stand beside hers, yet the Earl's question remained. Kessia considered the ledgers that still required review before any departure. The entailment threat moved faster than estate gains, and the ball offered both opportunity and exposure. The cottage settled into quiet as the tide turned. No further rider arrived. Kessia sat with the invitation and the letter until the first light touched the garden gate. The unresolved question of armor and connection stayed with her, carried forward into the preparations she could no longer delay. Chapter 8. Kessia folded the invitation once more before placing it beside the Earl's letter on the table. The lantern had burned low during the night, its flame steady now against the first gray light at the window, casting long shadows across the scattered papers that documented every attempt to secure their position. She rose and secured the door against the turning tide, the bolt sliding home with a muted click that seemed to echo the finality of the choice she had made. Then she stepped toward the waiting carriage without looking back at the harbor beam sweeping the water, its rhythmic pulse a reminder of the distance already growing between the quiet certainties of the cottage and the uncertain ground that waited in London. At the London Assembly, the chandeliers hung low over the polished floor, their crystals catching the movement of silk and velvet while throwing fractured light across spaces turned carefully neutral. Earl Waleed Harrington stood near the far wall, shoulders angled slightly away from the nearest cluster of guests, the posture of a man who knew every glance carried weight. A dowager in pale lavender addressed him directly, her fan half raised as though it might shield her from the answer she sought. He answered in a low voice that carried only to her ear, each word measured and complete, though inside he measured the cost of every syllable against the rumors already circling like smoke. Lord Darius Harrington circled the edge of the room once, his gaze fixed on the Earl with the patience of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He paused beside the dowager and leaned forward, his expression arranged in lines of false concern that drew the eye without seeming to demand it. The entailment papers, he said, had already been drawn and would reach the solicitors before the month closed. His tone suggested regret rather than triumph. Yet 3 heads turned toward him at once, the movement subtle but decisive, like guests shifting away from a draft. Miss Kezia Thorne stood beneath her chaperone's watchful eye at the refreshment table, the press of bodies around her offering momentary cover. Her fingers adjusted the edge of her glove rather than tracing any rim. A small motion that drew no notice yet allowed her to slip the folded square of paper into the attendant's waiting palm without a word. The square traveled onward along the table's cloth, passed between trays of untouched ices, its journey invisible amid the low murmur of conversations that never quite reached her. Mr. Leandro Quinn watched from across the floor, arms crossed as they had been the previous evening, the stance of a man still deciding where his loyalty might settle. A second whisper reached toward the Earl from another quarter, this one carrying the sharp edge of speculation about past debts and future claims. Quinn uncrossed his arms and stepped forward, intercepting the speaker with a clipped question about the new drainage works on his own land. The words were ordinary, yet the timing cut the whisper short before it could reach the dowager, and Quinn's shoulders eased fractionally as the speaker redirected his attention. The Earl replied to the lavender fan without raising his volume, his gaze steady on the dowager's face, as though the rest of the room had ceased to exist. The coastal holdings required only careful management, he said, and the ledgers already showed improvement under recent guidance. He offered no defense beyond the plain facts. Yet one name was restored to the evening's list, before the current set concluded, the dowager's nod so slight it might have been overlooked by anyone not watching for it. Darius drew 3 additional listeners with a further remark on the risks of association, his voice pitched low enough to invite leaning closer. The nearest guests shifted their positions, creating a wider space around the Earl where the floor had been crowded moments earlier, the movement carrying the quiet force of a tide pulling away from shore. Kezia's note arrived at his hand during the brief interval between sets, delivered by the same attendant who had accepted it earlier, the square warm from its passage through careful fingers. Waleed opened the square beneath the shelter of his cuff, the single line reading that the cottage ledgers remained open for review upon his return. The words steadied something inside him that had begun to fray under the weight of each new question, and he answered the next inquiry from a neighboring landowner with the same deliberate tone, the note's presence steadying the cadence of each phrase, even as his thoughts turned to the woman who had sent it and the price she paid for remaining unseen. The musicians struck the opening chords of the final dance, the strings rising above the diminishing conversations. Couples moved toward the center while the Earl remained at the wall, the note still folded against his palm, its edges creasing further under the pressure of his thumb. Kezia stood at the opposite side of the room, her chaperone's attention now turned toward an arriving carriage outside the tall windows, the momentary distraction granting her one clear line of sight across the floor to the man who had accepted her message without looking up. Darius lingered near the dowager, his posture relaxed yet positioned to observe every departure, the angle of his head suggesting he catalogued each guest who still lingered near the Earl. Quinn remained nearby, his stance no longer rigid, though he offered no further word, his eyes tracking the slow drift of the crowd as though measuring how much ground had been lost. The question of whether the evening's defense would preserve or further compromise the standing of both the Earl and the former governess hung in the space between the remaining guests and the opening figures of the dance, unanswered and sharpening with every passing measure. The dowager's fan closed with a soft snap. She extended her hand to Waleed for the set, her expression unchanged, the gesture carrying the weight of a public choice made under the eyes of those who had already begun to turn away. He accepted without hesitation, the note disappearing into his coat as they stepped forward. The chandeliers continued their slow sway above the floor, catching the edge of the lavender silk as the couple entered the pattern, their joined hands visible to anyone still watching. Kessia watched the movement from her place at the table. Her chaperone returned from the window with news of another arrival, yet the single line from the cottage remained the only certainty carried into the dance. The assembly would continue until the carriages lined the street once more, and the entailment rumors would travel with them, carried in the same carriages that had brought the guests and would now carry their judgments home. Chapter 9. The courier's horse had scarcely turned the bend when Kezia Thorne lifted the folded sheets from the gravel at the estate gate. Salt wind tugged at the edges, carrying the sharp tang of seaweed and whetstone from the cliffs below. Ink smeared beneath her thumb, still fresh enough to mark the linen of her glove with a dark crescent. The terms sprawled across the page in a clerk's precise hand. The entailment claim listed every acre of the Harrington holdings, with Darius Harrington's name inserted where Waleed's ought to stand. She read the final clause twice, the paper crackling in the steady gust that blew in from the sea. Her pulse quickened, though she kept her face still. The words felt less like a legal notice, and more like a quiet theft already in progress. A tenant's cart rumbled past the Lighthouse Cottage before noon. The wheels crunched over loose stones, and the driver, a man whose fields bordered the eastern boundary, called across the low wall without dismounting. His voice carried the flat caution of someone repeating news he wished he had not heard. Word in the village says the Earl must quit before quarter day. The papers name another master already. He touched his hat, eyes flicking once toward the cottage windows, as though checking for watchers, then drove on. The wheels left fresh ruts in the lane, and the smell of turned earth lingered. Kessia set the kettle aside untouched. Steam rose and faded against the cold panes. She changed neither her walking dress nor her gloves before setting out, though her fingers lingered on the latch as she considered the distance she was about to cross. The path to the main house cut through the kitchen garden. Rosemary released its scent as her skirts brushed the stems, and thyme crushed underfoot added a sharper note. Gulls wheeled overhead, their calls thin against the wind. At the study door she paused only long enough to smooth the papers against her palm, feeling the damp edge once more. Her mind turned over the tenant's words and the ink still drying on the page. Retreating now would only widen the space she had already begun to close. Waleed Harrington stood at the window overlooking the drive, shoulders angled toward the sea rather than the room. Light from the gray afternoon caught the edge of his profile, revealing the tension in his jaw. He turned at the sound of the latch, the movement deliberate, as though he had been expecting interruption, but not this one. "Miss Thorne," he said, the words low and unhurried. "The hour is early for calls." She placed the documents on the desk between them. The oak surface felt solid beneath her hand, anchoring her against the impulse to withdraw. These arrived at the gate this morning. The ink had not yet dried. Her fingers remained on the edge of the top sheet, tracing the margin once before she withdrew her hand. She watched him study the distance she had kept between the desk and the door, noting how his gaze measured it without comment. He did not reach for them at once. Instead, he studied the space between them, the faint crease at the corner of his mouth suggesting he weighed her presence against the risk of being seen together. "Darius moves quickly when the tone sits unguarded," he observed. The pause that followed allowed the clock on the mantel to mark 3 full seconds, each one stretching the silence. "The tenant who passed the cottage spoke of relocation before quarter day," she continued after a measured pause. "I thought the information should not wait." Her gloves still carried the faint smear. She resisted the urge to rub them clean. Waleed's gaze returned to her face. "He might have sent a note by the same hand that brought these." He indicated the papers with a slight motion of his wrist, yet his shoulders remained turned half away, as though part of him still faced the cliffs and the questions they held. "I considered it," Kezia said. The pause lengthened until the clock on the mantel marked the seconds again. She felt the weight of the choice she had made, the walk through the garden now seeming both necessary and dangerous. "I chose instead to come myself. The distance between the cottage and this room has grown narrower than the distance between reputation and fact." Her voice stayed even, but the admission settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. He lowered himself into the chair behind the desk without shifting the papers. His fingers rested on the armrest, drumming once before stilling. "Then we are agreed that the estate requires a steadier hand than rumor supplies." The words carried agreement, yet his eyes searched hers for the deeper current beneath them. A soft scrape sounded beneath the door. The corner of a sealed letter appeared on the carpet, pushed forward by an unseen footstep that retreated at once. Kezia retrieved it, the wax cool against her fingertips. The seal bore Darius's signet. The imprint crisped. She broke it and read the single line aloud. The Dowager's choice last evening changes nothing when the tone already names the heir. The sentence hung in the air, its brevity more threatening than any longer threat. Walid accepted the letter from her without comment. He folded it once and set it beside the entailment sheets, the motion precise. The lighthouse beam swept across the study window, its white flash eliminating the ink stains on Kezia's glove and the faint tremor in her fingers before they steadied. Her hand rested again on the papers, still and deliberate. "If the alliance we form here is to stand," he said at last, voice lower now, "it must withstand the cost the tone now places upon it." He did not look away, and the admission of shared risk lingered in the space between them. Keisha met his eyes across the desk. The beam passed again, casting shifting light over the documents. "The question remains whether any choice made in this room can survive once the carriages carry the news home." Neither moved to answer it. The papers lay open, the letter beside them, while outside the wind continued its steady press against the glass. Chapter 10. Walid Harrington drew the final letter from its envelope at the terrace table, its surface now free of moss, and set with a single oil lamp whose flame held steady against the evening breeze. The restored stones beneath his boots still carried the faint scent of salt from the morning scrubbing, and the papers lay in ordered rows beside a pen and a fresh sheet of foolscap. His shoulders angled slightly away from the open view of the sea as he read the confirmation from the last solicitor, the words confirming the estate's accounts now balanced without the prior encumbrances. Yet the victory felt thin, the ink on the page insufficient against the larger ledger of names and glances that would greet them once the season resumed. He traced the edge of the foolscap with one fingertip, listening to the distant roll of waves that seemed to measure each second of the silence he had chosen. Halima Voss appeared at the garden gate without announcement, her nod sharp once she caught his eye. She moved with the measured tread of one who had spent years carrying messages between divided rooms, her cloak drawn close against the cooling air. "The last of the neutral voices has spoken," she said, voice direct, yet carrying the soft accent of her upbringing. "The assembly will disperse before any further word from London can alter their stance." She placed a folded note on the table's edge and withdrew at once, leaving the paper unopened for the moment, though her eyes lingered a fraction longer on the separate stack of invitations already set aside. Walid watched her retreat along the path, noting the way her shoulders held the posture of a person who had delivered worse news before and learned not to wait for thanks. He broke the seal himself. The message stated only that 3 houses had declined Darius Harrington's calls that afternoon, their doors remaining shut to his inquiries. A faint tightening moved through Walid's jaw as he set it beside the alliance letters without comment. He could picture his cousin at each threshold, the polite refusal, the drawn curtains, the sound of bolts sliding home, and wondered how many of those refusals had come from men who once owed Darius favors. The thought pressed against the relief of the signed accounts, reminding him that security on paper rarely survived the first evening of returned scrutiny. He reached instead for the betrothal document prepared earlier that week, its creases still sharp from the rector's careful folding. Clara Thorne approached from the cottage path, her fingers tracing once along the rim of the cup she carried before she set it down untouched. The steam had long since faded, leaving only the faint trace of cooled tea on the air. She stood at his right hand, her presence steady yet charged with the same restrained awareness that had marked every exchange since the Restoration began. Walid felt the weight of her silence as he signed the agreement under the witness of the local rector, who added his own mark in silence, the quill scratching across parchment like a single thread pulled taut. The title document followed, its seal now restored and the coastal holdings secured against the entailment claim. Kezia's gaze remained on the signatures rather than the distant water, as if counting the cost in each stroke of ink. A separate stack of forfeited London invitations rested at the far corner of the table, their edges aligned by Halima's earlier visit. Walid's fingers rested on the arm of the chair, drumming once before they stilled. He could smell the faint must of the paper, the same stock used for every season's round of calls, now rendered useless by the choices etched across the other documents. "The cost stands higher than the ledgers alone record," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Each signature here removes another invitation that will not be replaced." The words settled between them without echo. Kezia's hand hovered briefly near the invitations before withdrawing, her expression composed yet shadowed by the knowledge that these refusals would multiply once the Ton learned the full shape of their agreement. Kezia remained beside him, her posture measured as the rector withdrew down the path, his footsteps fading into the rustle of evening wind through the low hedges. The agreement lay complete between them, its terms plain yet binding under the law of the realm. Outside the low wall, the first stars appeared above the waterline, pricking the darkening sky like distant signals. Waleed studied the way her sleeve brushed the table's edge, the small motion betraying nothing and everything at once. He wondered how many evenings would pass before such proximity became its own test, the boundary between neighbor and betrothed narrowing under eyes that had already begun to measure every glance. They walked together toward the boundary wall as dusk settled, the path cleared of the earlier debris. Waleed kept his steps even, his gaze on the ground ahead rather than the horizon, the crunch of gravel underfoot a steady counterpoint to the rising tide. Kezia matched his pace, the hem of her dress brushing the stones without sound, though her breathing carried the faint quickening of one who held questions she would not yet voice. The air grew cooler, carrying the brine of the sea and the faint green scent of disturbed earth from the restored garden beds. He could feel the unspoken ledger between them, the names already lost, the gatherings they would attend as near strangers, the careful distance required until summer's end. At the wall they paused. The lighthouse beams swept across the restored terrace and the cottage garden, illuminating the chaste space between them before moving on. Its light caught the pale stone of the boundary and the dark line of the sea beyond, then vanished into the gathering dark. Waleed turned slightly, his profile outlined against the flash of light. "The Ton will test this at the next gathering," he observed, the words carrying no rise in volume. He felt the question press at the back of his throat whether the same doors that closed on Darius would one day close on them both, but held it. Kessia's hand rested on the wall's top, steady now. "The alliance holds only if we name its limits before others do." The beam returned, casting a brief light over the separate stack of invitations visible from where they stood. She did not look at him directly, yet the angle of her shoulders suggested she tracked every shift in his stance, every hesitation left unspoken. Waleed named the cost once more in the same deliberate tone. "Reputation requires that we meet as neighbors only until the season ends." The salt air carried the words without echo, and for a moment the only sound was the distant rush of water against the rocks. The vista of the secured estate stretched before them, the cottage lights now visible through the restored windows, warm and contained. Neither moved to return inside. The beam swept again, its path unbroken across the boundary wall, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch the distance between them even as they stood side by side. Waleed felt the weight of the evening settle deeper, the promise of future visits already tempered by the knowledge that each one would be weighed and measured by those who had not yet spoken their final word. "Can the cost be borne without further loss?" Waleed asked, turning his head to meet her eyes at last, "when the next assembly demands we stand apart?" The question lingered in the salt air, unanswered, while the lighthouse beam continued its measured sweep over the estate they had reclaimed.